If you were a human living more than 10 millennia ago, the end of the Ice Age didn't arrive with a dramatic cosmic trumpet blast or a memo from the sky saying, "Dear humans, big changes coming. Please dress accordingly." No, what you'd notice instead was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Great Thaw began in the most anticlimactic way possible. Fractions of degrees creeping upward over centuries, like the world's slowest oven preheating. And yet, this microscopic shift was enough to start rearranging the entire planet, one insultingly subtle moment at a time. Before we journey back to the long, uncertain days at the end of the Ice Age, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing the story of human survival begin. Now let's begin in this sleepy journey together. Imagine waking up every day in a landscape shaped by walls of ice taller than skyscrapers, because for tens of thousands of years that was normal. Ice sheets sat on the land like a giant who fell asleep and refused to get back up. They determined your migration routes, your hunting trails, your access to fresh water, even where the wind came from. These frozen giants weren't simply part of the world, they were the world. And then, without asking anyone, they started to shrink, not melt dramatically, not collapse like cinematic glaciers in a disaster movie. Shrink. Retreating backward year after year, as if embarrassed for overstaying their welcome and trying to sneak out quietly before you noticed. Except you did notice. Your favourite hunting valley? It suddenly had more mud than dignity. The river you crossed every season, it found a brand new path because the land beneath it wasn't as frozen solid as it used to be. Even the horizon looked different. Landmarks you used to navigate by began disappearing as the ice pulled away, leaving behind unfamiliar hills, rocky moraines, and lakes the size of small countries. The Earth was essentially running a massive home renovation project, and humans were the confused tenants trying not to panic as the walls rearrange themselves. The planet redecorates without consulting the tenants. One year, your camp sits on a comfortable patch of frozen ground. A few generations later, the same spot is a wetland filled with new plants, new animals, and new ways to get your feet soaked. It's as if the world decided to switch biome templates at random. Tundra became shrubland. Shrubland became forest. Forest became whatever chaotic transitional mess the climate felt like experimenting with that millennium. Every ancestor's mental map became outdated, a broken GPS that insisted the glacier was still recalculating somewhere ahead. And then there were the coastlines. The ocean, which had politely stayed far away during the colder era, began creeping inland as sea levels rose. Entire land bridges vanished underwater. Your great-great-grandparents walked from one continent to another. You, however, would drown if you tried. The world you inherited had fewer shortcuts, more coastlines, and plenty of new opportunities to be confused about where the land ends and your future begins. To add to the chaos, meltwater poured from the glaciers in colossal bursts whenever a natural ice dam broke. Imagine living peacefully near a valley and suddenly witnessing enough water to fill multiple modern reservoirs roaring past you, like the planet flushing a cosmic toilet. These catastrophic floods carved canyons, ripped through forests, and erased entire regions in days. Your storytelling tradition would struggle to explain this, because the sky dropped a river on us is not the easiest myth to refine. As the ice retreated, new ecosystems followed. Plants marched northward like a botanical army expanding territory root by root. Birch, pine, and later oak entered the scene, transforming the landscape from treeless tundra to patchy forest and eventually thick woodland. To you, this wasn't a peaceful greening of the earth. It was a growing list of obstacles to trip over while hunting. New vegetation meant new animal behaviours, new foraging challenges, and entirely new pollen allergies that early humans did not sign up for. But the melting wasn't evenly distributed. Some regions warmed faster, others held onto the cold like a stubborn relative refusing to leave the holiday dinner. You could travel a few hundred miles and find climates that didn't agree on what century it was. The world wasn't just changing, it was changing inconsistently, inconveniently, and with no regard for how difficult it made your daily commute by foot. What makes this era remarkable isn't simply the amount of melting, it's the speed. Geological change usually moves slower than the plot of a very boring book. But during the end of the Ice Age, temperatures shifted dramatically on human timescales. Not, wake up and the ice is gone, dramatic, but enough that your grandchildren would inherit a different world from the one you grew up in. In prehistory, that was basically hyperspeed. And as the ice thinned and withdrew, the pressure on the land changed too. Entire regions rose, literally lifted upward as the crushing weight of thousands of feet of ice eased. Ground that had been pressed flat sprang back like a memory foam mattress, relieved of a heavy sleeper. Rivers altered course. Lakes expanded. Earthquakes rattled some regions. It was a global chiropractic adjustment you didn't schedule. The melting world wasn't just warmer, it was unfamiliar and unsettling, and wet in places that used to be reliably frozen. But through it all, humans adapted. Not gracefully, never that, but effectively enough to survive the planet's massive, unsolicited makeover. And this was just the beginning. The ice was retreating, the world was changing shape, and people had to figure out new ways to exist in a landscape that never stopped moving. If you were a human navigating the world at the end of the Ice Age, you didn't just live through warming, you lived through chaos. The planet wasn't transitioning gracefully from frozen wasteland to stable, pleasant grassland. It was behaving like a confused apprentice trying to run the weather system for the first time. One year felt semi-normal. The next year felt like nature had spilled its climate settings and was pressing random buttons to see what would happen. Yesterday was spring. Today is betrayal. Seasonal patterns, the ones your ancestors relied on for thousands of years, began to wobble like an unbalanced wheel. Storms appeared at the wrong time. Droughts arrived with no warning. Rain fell where it had no business falling. Cold spells bludgeoned entire regions without mercy, even as the world overall trended warmer. Early humans had no weather apps, but they didn't need them. Their bones told them something was off, and their bones were rarely wrong. The most dramatic example of this planetary mood swing was the Younger Dryas, a period when temperatures in many regions plunged back to near glacial conditions after centuries of warming. It was the climate equivalent of the universe saying, "Actually, I changed my mind," and slamming the brakes so hard that ecosystems skidded across continents. Plants that were spreading northward retreated again. Animals shifted ranges like confused nomads trying to refine their place in the world. Humans, caught in the middle, simply blinked and tried to adapt to conditions reversing faster than they could update their survival strategies. Imagine you've spent generations adjusting to a gradually softening world. Snow melts earlier, summers stretch longer. Your clan begins relying on new foraging zones and new migration patterns because finally, the weather has become slightly less murderous. Then, abruptly, it all snaps back. Temperatures plummet. Winters hit like sledgehammers. The rivers freeze longer. Food sources collapse again. Your body, your culture, your memories, all calibrated to this new, warmer world, suddenly feel outdated. The climate had pulled a reversal worthy of a bad plot twist. But the Younger Dryas wasn't the only curveball. Even outside that event, climate oscillations occurred on scales humans could experience within a lifetime. This wasn't the distant, slow-moving geology of continents drifting. This was immediate personal weather chaos. The kind that forced you to rethink your entire survival strategy every generation. A warm decade could entice you to explore new lands or depend on new animals. A sudden cold phase could smash those decisions, leaving you with a very awkward family meeting about who suggested moving to this region in the first place. Some groups migrated repeatedly, not because they were adventurous, but because the environment kept firing them from their old jobs. For early humans, weather wasn't background noise. It was the scriptwriter of existence. When it behaved erratically, life became a guessing game where the stakes were survival. One year, berries ripened early. The next year, they didn't ripen at all. One winter was mild and generous, letting people stretch food stores comfortably. The next winter arrived 6 weeks early and practically punched the camp in the face. And there was no long-term memory to rely on. Nothing was predictable long enough for a tradition to stabilise. A strategy that worked for your parents might fail catastrophically for you. Travellers returning from a neighbouring region might bring news of weather so different it felt like describing a separate universe. Environmental variation over short distances created microclimates, small pockets where warmth lingered or cold clung stubbornly, making planning even more complicated. Species were caught in this mayhem too. Plants advanced northward during warming phases, then died back when temperatures dipped. Animals followed the vegetation or fled from the cold. Migration routes twisted and expanded like spilled ink. Some species thrived temporarily in new conditions, only to vanish when the climate flipped again. Humans couldn't rely on any one prey animal for long. Even sturdy creatures adapted to harsh cold. Reindeer, muskoxen and others shifted ranges in ways that sometimes aligned beautifully with human needs, and sometimes didn't. And the skies weren't exactly peaceful. The end of the Ice Age saw stronger winds in some areas, more violent storms in others. Atmospheric circulation patterns wobbled like an off-balance spinning top. Rivers changed flow rates unpredictably. Meltwater pulses altered ocean currents, which then reshaped global temperatures, which then produced more confusion. It was a domino effect that ensured no one, not even the climate system, fully understood what was happening. Early humans responded the only way they could, by treating flexibility as a survival strategy. They no longer trusted the old rules. Calendars, if you could call them that, became more observational and less traditional. Instead of "we hunt here in early spring," it was "we hunt here when the world looks like it feels like letting us." If the weather changed abruptly, so did your plans, your tools, your food expectations, and sometimes even your home. This wasn't a world where humans could rely on normal. This was a world where normal had packed its bags and run away. The humour, in hindsight, writes itself. The climate during this era was like an indecisive dinner guest. Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, never satisfied, always making you redo the menu. But for the people living through it was survival by improvisation, reacting to a planet that seemed determined to throw seasonal tantrums for centuries at a time. No one living then could predict that the chaos would eventually settle into the stable climate of the Holocene. They only knew that weather kept changing its mind, and that staying alive required the kind of constant awareness modern humans reserve for checking whether their phone charger is working. And so, each day began with a question: what version of the world are we waking up to today? Because if yesterday was spring, today might be betrayal. Picture this. Your clan has been returning to the same hunting valley for generations. The place is reliable, predictable, a cornerstone of your seasonal rhythm. Your grandparents hunted there. Your parents hunted there. You learned to hunt there. You could navigate it blindfolded, though doing so would be a fast way to become mammoth decor. The point is, this place is yours, and then one day, it isn't. You arrive, expecting hard ground, open visibility, and familiar game paths, and instead you're greeted by a squelching sound beneath your feet. Your boots sink, your spear sinks, your dignity sinks. Congratulations, your hunting grounds are now a swamp, not metaphorically, not seasonally, permanently. You didn't move, your neighbourhood did. This was the reality for countless humans living through the environmental transformation triggered by the end of the Ice Age. As temperatures rose and the colossal ice sheets retreated, the land beneath them began to shift in ways that felt personal, inconvenient, and occasionally rude. What was once frozen tundra, dry, solid, flat, dependable, started taking on new lives of its own. Melting ice soaked the ground. Rivers changed direction, lowlands filled with water, lakes formed seemingly overnight. The planet was melting its giant ice cubes, and all that runoff needed somewhere to go. Unfortunately, many of those somewheres were right on top of your best hunting spots. The transformation from tundra to forest was one of the most dramatic ecological overhauls in human history. For tens of thousands of years, people thrived in open landscapes where visibility stretched for miles, and herds of large animals moved in slow, predictable patterns. You could track prey by footprints, by broken shrubs, by distant movement, even by the silhouette of an animal against the pale horizon. But as the climate warmed, plants celebrated, and when plants celebrate, they throw a forest. Shrubs crept in first, low, scraggly pioneers that ruined line of sight and snagged at your clothing. You could still hunt here, but it became an obstacle course of tripping hazards. Then came taller vegetation, thicker shrubs, early trees, all eager to move into the newly available soil that had been locked under ice for millennia. Birch and pine advanced like enthusiastic volunteers on a reforestation mission no one authorized. Grassland shrank, forest patches expanded, animals that once travelled openly across vast plains now disappeared into foliage thick enough to hide a small army. The environment didn't gently transition, it shifted. Entire landscapes flipped from one biome to another over a handful of generations, fast enough that elders remembered when a place was different, but slow enough that you couldn't argue with the new reality. And then there were the wetlands. Melting permafrost created conditions for water to pool instead of draining. Ground that used to be as firm as packed stone became a sponge. Walking became a sloshing adventure in which your footwear tried to escape your feet with every step. Pools, marshes, bogs. They all formed spontaneously, without warning, and without the courtesy of signage. Plains where caribou once migrated now trapped your clan in mud. Shallow ponds attracted insects the size of your regrets. The terrain turned from an efficient hunting highway into a treacherous labyrinth where each step was a gamble. Even worse, your prey adapted faster than you did. Smaller animals flourished in the new wetlands. Birds appeared in staggering numbers. Certain fish species moved into the standing water, but the old megafauna trails, gone, buried, submerged, ruined. This wasn't only a nuisance, it completely upended travel. Groups accustomed to crossing dry valleys found themselves skirting enormous lakes that hadn't existed a century earlier. Routes took longer, dangers multiplied. The landscape became unpredictable, not because the land was dangerous, but because it wouldn't stop changing. And the rivers, oh, the rivers. Nothing was more frustrating for early humans than the betrayal of a familiar river. A path you once followed faithfully could suddenly fork into 2 channels, or 3, or just vanish into marshland. Sediments piled up, banks collapsed, entire river systems relocated. You would swear the river had a personal vendetta against your navigation skills. These shifts didn't just inconvenience humans, they forced cultural transitions. As forests expanded, new animals moved in. Deer, smaller game, and various forest-loving species became more dominant. Hunting strategies evolved. Spears changed shape. Tracking methods shifted toward listening rather than seeing. The once predictable, wide-open world became a sensory puzzle, where silence mattered more than vantage points. Plant life also offered new foraging opportunities, but only if you were willing to experiment. New berries, nuts, roots, and greens appeared, each with its own eat-me-and-find-out risk profile. Ancestral knowledge suddenly felt incomplete. Elders who had mastered the open tundra were forced to admit, painfully, that they had no idea which shrubs were poisonous and which were dinner. Even the temperature of the land changed. Forest floors remained cooler and more humid than the exposed tundra. This affected everything from where animals slept to when plants sprouted. The physical structure of the world shifted so fundamentally that early humans had to rebuild their understanding of time and movement. A place that once took a day to cross could now take 2. A site that once served as a camp became uninhabitable due to flooding or thick vegetation. And of course, bugs. Wetlands brought insects in quantities that tested the patience of saints. Mosquitoes didn't just bite, they formed clouds. Being outdoors meant being a buffet. You adapted or you itched. In the end, the landscape humans once mastered reshaped itself entirely, without warning and without remorse. Your ancestors didn't thrive because the land stayed the same. They thrived because they learned to read its new language. You didn't move, your neighbourhood did, and somehow you had to keep up. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived alongside a caste of animals so large, so impressive, and so unapologetically oversized that the Ice Age world looked like it had been designed by a committee of children who were told, "Go wild." Mammoths as tall as houses, giant sloths as heavy as cars, enormous deer with antlers so wide they needed their own postal codes. It was a megafaunal paradise, assuming your definition of paradise included the daily risk of being trampled, gored, or accidentally stepped on by something majestic. And then, slowly and mysteriously, the giants began to vanish, not with spectacle, not with drama. There were no extinction parades or farewell meteor strikes. The great animals simply faded out of the landscape one by one, like reluctant actors leaving a stage mid-scene. You could go to sleep knowing mammoths lived nearby and wake up a generation later, realizing no one had seen a mammoth in years. Dinner quietly goes extinct. But disappearing dinner was only one part of the problem. The loss of megafauna disrupted entire food webs. These animals were more than meals. They were ecosystem engineers whose movements shaped the world. The mammoth, for example, wasn't just a walking freezer full of steaks. It knocked down trees, maintained grasslands, and carved trails through snow and brush. Without it, forests thickened, grasslands shrank, the land changed character, and small humans, who once navigated by well-worn mammoth paths, now had to fight their way through vegetation dense enough to hide a small army, or a large one. Yet, from the perspective of people alive at the time, the extinctions weren't ecological events. They were personal losses. Imagine telling your children about the legendary woolly beasts that once thundered across the plains, only for them to respond, "Are you sure they were real? You didn't dream them, right?" You'd insist they existed. You'd swear it on your best spear. But deep down, you'd wonder why these creatures had left without saying goodbye. Scientists today offer a range of explanations, but early humans didn't have the benefit of academic journals. They only saw symptoms, fewer tracks, fewer herds, fewer shadows on the horizon. Some groups likely assumed the animals had migrated elsewhere and waited for them to return. Others saw their absence as a sign from the spirit world, and many simply adapted because not adapting meant starving. So what was going on? One factor was the biological disadvantage of being enormous. Big animals take longer to reproduce, need more food, and cannot pivot quickly when conditions shift. Think of them as the prehistoric version of large corporations. Powerful, impressive, but hopelessly slow to react. If a mammoth needed 2 decades to replace itself, one bad run of years could devastate a population. Another complication, predators. Not saber-toothed cats, us. Humans hunted megafauna with a persistence and creativity that bordered on obsessive. A mammoth wasn't just meat, it was meat, fat, bones for tools, hides for shelter, and prestige for the hunters who brought it down. A successful mammoth hunt fed an entire community. It also inspired future hunts, because nothing motivates people like a giant walking pantry. But hunting alone doesn't explain everything. If humans caused extinctions by themselves, they would have done so in a neat pattern. Instead, the decline of megafauna was messy and inconsistent. Some animals vanished quickly, others lingered for thousands of years. A few, like the woolly mammoth on Wrangel Island, held on into the age of Egyptian pyramids, long after the rest of their species had disappeared. Meanwhile, giant sloths vanished in the Americas but still survived in smaller tropical relatives. The extinction wave wasn't a clean sweep, it was ecological whack-a-mole. Disease may have played a role too. As environments shifted and species moved into unfamiliar territories, pathogens likely hitched rides. A disease that megafauna had no immunity to could spread rapidly among groups with low population density. Humans would have noticed animals dying, but they couldn't have known why. The only clue was that the biggest beast got sick fastest. And let's not forget the challenges of being a creature that literally can't hide. Large animals aren't subtle. You always knew when a mammoth herd was nearby because the ground vibrated. When people hunted them, they could be seen from miles away. Modern prey animals panic at the crack of a twig. Mammoths. They were calm until the spears arrived, and by then it was a bit late for evasive manoeuvres. But the strangest part of the megafaunal disappearance wasn't the cause, it was the cascading effect on human life. Losing large game meant losing predictability. Mammoths migrated in patterns that could be anticipated. Giant deer returned to the same grounds year after year. Even ancient predators followed routines. But as these animals vanished, humans were forced to diversify. They hunted smaller creatures that offered less reward for more effort. They relied on plants, fish, and inconsistent mid-sized animals. They had to adjust tools, strategies, and expectations, all because nature decided to retire its largest cast members. And while we now understand extinction as a scientific process, early humans felt the gut-level reality. The world was shrinking. Not geographically, but spiritually. The giants that once defined the landscape no longer walked the earth. Their absence altered not just diets, but stories, myths, and the way people imagined their own place in the world. You grew up believing that mammoths roamed forever. Then they didn't, and you had to move on. Dinner quietly goes extinct, and survival gets louder. When the giants began disappearing, humans had to confront a harsh and humbling truth. The future of dinner was small. Gone were the days of pointing across the horizon at a towering mammoth and saying, "Let's eat that one." Instead, people now faced an army of creatures that moved too fast, hid too well, and weighed so little that a successful hunt felt less like victory and more like mild compensation. It was the dawn of a new era, one defined by speed instead of spectacle. And humans quickly learned that chasing smaller animals is way more annoying. For thousands of years, hunting large animals meant applying strength, teamwork, endurance, and careful planning. Bringing down a woolly beast required courage, but once it fell, the reward was immense. Large prey didn't just feed families, it fed entire communities. It gave humans security, routine, and a sense that all the effort, danger, and frostbite were worth it. But when the megafauna faded, humans had to redirect their expertise from bring down giant walking food factories to catch the fast-twitching creature that can vanish into a hole the size of your fist. Turns out rabbits don't politely stand still like mammoths. Small prey introduced an entirely new set of problems. They were agile, they were nervous, they reproduced quickly, meaning there were many of them, but catching even one required precision. A rabbit didn't wait for you. A fox didn't lumber toward your spear. Even deer, still larger than the small game but nowhere near mammoth tier, required stalking techniques humans had not prioritized before. So humans innovated. Traps, outsourcing the annoyance. The first solution wasn't to run faster. Humans are persistent, but we're not built like sprinters. Instead, they created traps. Clever, simple, effective. Pitfalls, snares, deadfalls, and wicker cages became standard pieces of survival technology. These tools allowed humans to catch small animals without chasing them across half a continent. Traps had several advantages. They worked while you slept. They worked while you ate. They worked while you pretended not to be frustrated by your lack of recent success. A well-placed snare line near a game trail transformed a bad hunting day into a decent one. Even better, people could set dozens of them. creating an automated food gathering system long before automation had a name. But traps weren't a magic fix. Animals learned. Some avoided them. Others triggered traps without getting caught. Occasionally, a hunter would return to find that a predator had beaten them to the catch. Nothing contained more heartbreak than discovering that your carefully arranged deadfall had fed a wolf instead of your family. Persistence. Hunting, because humans refused to give up. Another strategy humans embraced with renewed vigour was persistence hunting, the exhausting art of running an animal into submission. Humans can't sprint fast, but they excel at endurance. In hot weather, our ability to cool through sweating gives us an advantage over animals that overheat quickly. So when the prey was large enough to track but too fast or overpower directly, humans played a cruel game. Keep walking until the animal gets tired of being alive. Persistence hunting meant following a creature through brush, across plains, into forests, over hills, and, if necessary, into its own growing despair. Eventually the animal would collapse from heat stress or exhaustion. Was it glamorous? No. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Did it work? Yes, sometimes too well. But for smaller prey, persistence hunting was nearly useless. Rabbits do not get exhausted from running. They get exhausted from laughing at you from inside their burrows. Group hunts, organised chaos with spears. To catch mid-sized animals, deer, antelope, wild goats, humans leaned heavily on coordinated group hunts. Entire communities worked together to drive animals toward natural traps, cliffs, or narrow passages where hunters waited. This strategy demanded communication, timing, and trust. It was prehistoric choreography. Half the group made noise, the other half stayed quiet. Everyone hoped the animals ran in the correct direction. It didn't always go according to plan. If animals broke through the line, the entire operation dissolved into chaos. You could spend days preparing for a hunt only for a herd to turn left instead of right, leaving you covered in dust and disappointment. But when it worked beautifully, providing enough meat to make the whole ordeal worth the embarrassment. Hunting in forests, the new annoyance layer. As forests expanded, visibility shrank. Humans had to adjust tactics quickly. Stalking replaced running, ambushing replaced chasing, listening replaced watching. In open tundra, humans relied on sight. In forests, they needed silence. And silence is extremely hard to achieve in a group of hungry people wearing noisy leather and stepping on twigs. Some hunters developed a remarkable skill. They could move like shadows, blend into foliage, and get close enough to throw a precise spear. Others tripped, startled the prey, and forced everyone to pretend it wasn't their fault. A diet of diversity, whether you want it or not. Small game hunting didn't just change hunting methods, it changed diets. People now ate birds, rabbits, foxes, beavers, porcupines, with regrettable preparation mistakes, turtles, and pretty much anything that stayed still long enough. Every catch mattered, every animal counted, and every hunter learned the painful truth. Small prey required enormous effort for tiny returns. A single mammoth could feed your group for weeks. A rabbit fed whoever got to it first. But humans survived, not because chasing small animals was easy, but because they were adaptable, clever, persistent, and willing to invent entirely new ways of catching things that really didn't want to be caught. Welcome to the new culinary era. It's fast, it's unpredictable, it's annoying. Turns out rabbits don't politely stand still like mammoths. If you were a human living more than 10,000 years ago, you didn't plan meals. That phrasing implies a level of stability and optimism that simply did not exist. You survived surprises. Every day, every season, every migration cycle was a negotiation with hunger, a negotiation in which hunger usually won. Starvation wasn't a rare crisis. It was the background music of life, humming steadily beneath every choice your group made. Food insecurity ruled everything. Modern people might debate restaurants. Ice Age survivors debated whether they could afford to walk another hour without collapsing. Calories were the true currency of existence, and unlike modern bank accounts, your calorie balance could hit zero at any moment, without warning, without apology, and without overdraft protection. Seasonal chaos, the original unreliable pantry. The end of the Ice Age brought warmer temperatures, but warmth did not magically produce consistent food resources. Some seasons delivered abundance, berries exploding across meadows, fish practically leaping out of rivers, animals moving in herds so large they resembled a living horizon. Other seasons delivered disappointment so profound you questioned every decision that led you to this point. Winter, of course, was the tyrant. It devoured whatever food you gathered and gave nothing back. The months of cold were long stretches of rationing, guessing, hoping, and quietly regretting how much you ate yesterday. Hunger wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a constant roommate, inconvenient and impossible to evict. But summer wasn't guaranteed either. Some years were generous, others were cruel. A late frost could kill the plants you counted on. A dry spell could drive animals away. A sudden cold snap might wipe out the insects and fish that formed the base of the food chain. When the environment changed, it didn't send notifications. You don't plan meals, you survive surprises. Failed hunts, the most common kind. Even when your group was skilled, even when you had tools, teamwork and experience, hunts failed more often than they succeeded. Prey animals were unpredictable. They changed migration routes, vanished into forests, or simply didn't show up when you needed them. Some days you returned triumphant. Other days you returned with an empty stomach, a bruised ego, and one embarrassing story about tripping over a root in front of everyone. A failed hunt didn't just mean no dinner tonight. It meant less energy tomorrow, fewer calories to support travel, weaker immunity, and the creeping fear that you'd entered one of the bad years. Humans developed rituals, not because rituals guaranteed success, but because pretending to influence the hunt was emotionally better than admitting the universe didn't care. Gathering, the art of eating. Whatever doesn't kill you plants were a crucial backup system, but gathering was unpredictable too. Flowers bloomed too early. Fruits rotted too quickly. Nuts required painstaking cracking. Roots demanded digging in conditions that felt like dirt was actively resisting you. And every edible plant had at least one poisonous cousin waiting to ruin your week. Gathering required expertise, deep intergenerational knowledge about what to eat, when to eat it, and what not to touch unless you wanted hallucinations followed by silence. Even with knowledge, some seasons produced almost nothing. You could wander all day searching for berries, only to find a handful the birds hadn't already stolen. Calories rule everything around you. Forget modern worries. In the late glacial world, you thought about food constantly because energy was always precarious. Every action cost calories. Walking, expensive. Chasing an animal, very expensive. Digging roots, annoyingly expensive. Just being alive in the cold? Ridiculously expensive. Your metabolism was not your friend. Your body burned fuel rapidly to maintain warmth, muscle activity, and brain function. That meant every decision, whether to hunt, whether to stay put, whether to travel, had to be filtered through a simple equation. Do we have enough calories to do this without collapsing halfway? The answer was often no, but you did it anyway because not doing it guaranteed starvation. Hunger shapes culture. It wasn't just biology. Hunger shaped societies. Food scarcity influenced migration patterns, group size, child spacing, tool development, cooperation, and conflict with neighbouring clans. People lived lean because living any other way wasn't an option. When food was abundant, rarely, social bonds strengthened and rituals flourished. During scarcity, frequently, stress increased, arguments erupted, and leaders had to make impossible decisions, the mental weight of emptiness. Hunger didn't just drain the body, it clouded the mind. You thought slower. You walked slower. You dreamed of food the way modern people dream of vacations. A hungry brain fixated on survival, stripping away anything that wasn't immediately necessary. Creativity existed, but only when enough calories supported it. The human imagination had to fight for every spark it produced. And yet, even amid all this, humans endured. Groups found ways to ration carefully, share strategically, and innovate constantly. Hunger was relentless, but so were they. Short-term fullness, long-term fear. When your group finally killed an animal or found a bounty of plants, the relief was immediate, but short-lived. You feasted because your body demanded it. You also panicked slightly because you knew abundance didn't last. Every mouthful tasted like hope mixed with dread. Leftovers were rare, preservation was crude, spoilage was common. A full belly today didn't guarantee anything tomorrow. That's what made starvation the default setting. Survival wasn't measured in comfort, but in endurance. Humans survived not because they conquered hunger, but because they adapted to living with it. Every hour, every season, every unpredictable year. You don't plan meals, you survive surprises. For tens of thousands of years, Ice Age humans dressed for one clear purpose, not freezing to death. Clothing was functional, heavy, fur-lined, and designed to keep every molecule of body heat firmly trapped where it belonged. You wore layers upon layers because the world outside wanted you gone. Your fashion choices were, wear furs, become an ice sculpture. There was no third option. But as the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age, clothing became complicated. Suddenly survival gear designed for Arctic misery had to function in a world that occasionally, rudely, became warm. And nothing introduces frustration quite like discovering your carefully crafted winter outfit is trying to cook you alive. You dressed for winter, it's spring, you're sweating in furs, a world that refused to pick a temperature. Before warming began, humans didn't need separate wardrobes. They didn't need seasonal closets or light jackets or transitional attire. Every season was cold. Every day was cold. If you woke up and it wasn't cold, you were either hallucinating or standing near a fire. But with the end of the Ice Age came unpredictability. Mornings could be chilly. Afternoons could feel suspiciously warm. Evenings could freeze your eyelashes again. Dressing became a gamble. Wear too many layers and risk heat exhaustion. Wear too few and risk hypothermia. Neither option felt good. Both options felt personal. Early humans didn't think in terms of fashion. They thought in terms of survival efficiency. But this new climate regime forced them into their first brush with what modern people call weather confusion, leaving camp perfectly comfortable, only to regret every clothing decision by midday. Layering, humanity's first compromise with chaos. Layering became the most important clothing innovation of the era. Instead of one giant fur wrap that kept the cold out but also trapped regret inside, people began creating multiple lighter garments. That way, they could remove layers as the day warmed or add them back when temperatures plunged again. Of course, layering wasn't perfect. Removing layers required stopping, adjusting, tying, folding, and sometimes arguing with bits of clothing designed to be warm rather than cooperative. And you couldn't just drop a layer wherever. You'd lose it. Animals would steal it. Or another human might decide it was now theirs. Clothing was expensive. Clothing was labor-intensive. Clothing was basically prehistoric real estate. Still, layering made movement easier. Running, hunting, and traveling became less exhausting when you didn't feel like you were dragging an entire yak on your shoulders. Even so, nothing could fully prevent the experience of sweating miserably inside your furs while trying to pretend everything was fine. Material adaptation, creativity before comfort. As temperatures rose and environments changed, the materials available for clothing changed too. Forested regions provided bark fibers, plant-based threads, and softer inner barks that could be fashioned into garments surprisingly durable and surprisingly uncomfortable, at least at first. Humans experimented constantly, scraping hides differently, softening skins with new tools, mixing furs with woven fibres, and stitching garments that work better in warmer climates. They didn't have cotton, they didn't have linen, they had ingenuity. Animal sinew became thread, bone became needles, plant fibres became belts, ties, and wraps. Early fabrics were coarse and itchy, but they were lighter than winter furs and breathable enough that you didn't feel like you were slow roasting throughout the afternoon. The real challenge was predicting which material you'd actually need on any given day. A single cold snap could make a lighter outfit miserable. A sunny day could punish anyone wearing thick pelts. Clothing was no longer a simple protective shell. It was a daily negotiation with the sky. Overheating. The problem. No one asked for overheating became a real threat for the first time. In a world where the biggest problem used to be frostbite, the idea that you could collapse from heat felt insulting. Yet, it happened. Hunters pushing themselves in heavy gear found their bodies rebelling. Dizziness, weakness, and the sudden realization that maybe wearing 3 wolf pelts in April was a mistake. Your ancestors didn't describe heat stroke scientifically, they described it experientially. The world tilted, I fell over, and I contemplated death while sweating harder than anyone in human history. Removing clothing layers helped, but not always. Sweat, previously unimportant in frigid conditions, became a central bodily process, and a messy one when the garments you wore were designed to trap every drop. Moisture made clothing heavier. It made temperatures feel colder once the sun set. It made everything smell, lived in. Climate shapes. Craftsmanship. As wardrobe demands expanded, so did creativity. Clothing makers began shaping garments more precisely. Tight seams, fitted shoulders, movable joints, so people could adapt better to shifting conditions. This era saw the rise of more complex stitching patterns, improved hide softening techniques, decorative touches. Yes, people cared about looking good long before Instagram, and even early forms of footwear adapted to muddy, forested landscapes. Not because fashion was a priority, but because efficiency was. Better clothes meant better hunts, better travel, better survival. And still, for all their ingenuity, clothing remained a daily gamble. The emotional journey of getting dressed clothing was no longer merely a tool, it became a source of frustration, debate, and occasionally comedy. Too many layers, slow and sweaty, too few, frozen by sunset, wrong material, scratchy regret, forgotten outer wrap, congratulations, you've invented suffering. People living at this time didn't worry about matching colours or impressing strangers. They worried about not fainting from heat or freezing their extremities off because the weather changed its mind again. And although no one wrote about it, you can imagine the prehistoric conversations. Why are you wearing that? Because yesterday was winter. Today is not winter. I have made a mistake. Clothing as adaptation, not identity. As the climate shifted, people didn't just adapt physically, they adapted culturally. Clothing styles diversified from group to group depending on local environments. Those near coast developed lighter wraps to handle humidity. Forest dwellers crafted hide garments resistant to thorns and brush. People living in still cold regions doubled down on insulation, but with more flexibility than before. Human clothing was evolving just as fast as the climate demanded, and throughout it all, every morning began with the same resigned thought. What temperature will betrayal feel like today? You dressed for winter, it's spring, you're sweating in furs, and you carry on anyway. Before the end of the Ice Age, fire was already humanity's closest and most dangerous friend. It warmed frozen fingers, lit up dark camps, and roasted meat into something edible instead of something that tasted like regret. But as the world changed, fire went from being a pleasant, helpful companion to an absolutely essential survival tool. A tool for cooking, shaping landscapes, keeping predators away, and, crucially, regulating a body temperature that was constantly betrayed by unpredictable weather. Fire is the original multi-tool with a death option. Cooking, the first real culinary revolution. Long before cooking shows, celebrity chefs, or arguments about seasoning, early humans mastered the art of using fire to make food less deadly. As the environment shifted, diets changed. Strange plants appeared. Tougher meats emerged from new kinds of animals. Some foods became edible only after being thoroughly cooked into submission. Fire broke down fibres, softened roots, and neutralized toxins that would otherwise turn your digestive tract into a battlefield. It also made small game, now a big part of the diet, worth the effort. A tiny rabbit doesn't give much meat, but at least cooked meat tastes better than raw disappointment. Cooking also unlocked precious calories, and calories meant survival. The difference between living and starving might be the efficiency of your clan's fire pit. But fire wasn't just about eating. It was about transforming the environment, creating safety, and adapting to a world that no longer followed predictable rules. Fire as protection, the nighttime bodyguard. In a warming world, predators were not exactly decreasing in number. Wolves, cave lions, big cats, and other dangerous night stalkers still roamed. Forests grew thicker, wetlands grew deeper. Sounds echoed strangely at dusk. Everything hiding in the dark seemed closer than before. And so, humans turned to fire, the glowing, crackling beacon that predators respected. A controlled flame near camp deterred animals whose instincts warned them to stay away from heat and light. A perimeter of burning logs or scattered fire pits created a fortress long before humans built actual walls. Fire also made nights less psychologically draining. Instead of huddling in freezing darkness, you sat near warmth, listened to stories, watched sparks, and pretended, for a few precious hours, that you weren't one bad decision away from joining the fossil record. Predators feared fire, humans worshipped fire, and everyone respected the fact that getting too close to fire was a bad idea for all species involved. Fire as climate control, the first human thermostat. With the world lurching back and forth between warm spells and cold snaps, humans needed a way to regulate their body temperature that didn't rely solely on clothing, especially clothing that occasionally tried to cook them alive. Fire became the prehistoric thermostat. Too cold? Add more wood? Too hot? Move a little farther away and pretend you aren't melting. Need to dry clothes soaked by surprise wetlands? Fire. Need to warm up after hunting in freezing wind? Fire. Need to stop your feet from turning into numb, useless decorations? Fire. The ability to start, maintain and manage fire became more important than almost any other skill. A clan with fire lived longer. Not comfortably, but longer. A clan without fire simply became a cautionary tale. Fire for tools, the first engineering department. As environment shifted, fire became essential for crafting new tools suited to new prey and new landscapes. Humans heated stones before chipping them to make cutting edges sharper. They used fire hardening on wooden spear tips. They boiled animal sinew to make glue, sealed containers with heat-treated resin, and even used controlled fire to shape bone tools. This meant fire wasn't just for surviving, it was for innovating. Early humans didn't call this technology. They called it not dying from using bad equipment. In a world where small game demanded precision and new plant fibers required new techniques, fire was the silent workshop powering thousands of small revolutions. Fire for managing the land, humanity's first ecological experiment. One of the most remarkable uses of fire, rarely mentioned outside anthropology circles, is landscape management. Long before agriculture, humans used controlled burns to shape the environment in ways that helped them survive. Burning old grass allowed new plants to flourish. Clearing patches of forest attracted grazing animals. Reducing underbrush made hunting easier and prevented dangerous wildfires later. Fire wasn't just a reaction to nature, it was a tool for engineering nature. Imagine lighting the land on purpose to make future hunting easier. That's not just survival, that's strategy. Early humans learned when, where, and how to burn without destroying everything. This required observation, experience, and bravery, because mismanaging fire was a fast way to turn your landscape and your housing into charcoal. But when done right, fire created fertile areas that drew animals. It shaped migratory routes. It reset ecosystems. Humans didn't conquer nature, they nudged it. Fire gave them just enough control to stay alive without ever giving them the illusion they were in charge. Fire for community, the memory keeper. Fire also became the centre of human social life. It lit gatherings, warmed conversations, and created a shared space where stories, knowledge, and skill were passed between generations. Important lessons were told around firelight. Techniques were demonstrated in its glow. It was the world's first classroom and the world's first theatre, with shadows dancing on rock walls like early animation. When the environment grew unpredictable, when animals vanished, when hunger loomed, fire remained the constant around which the human world spun. Fire wasn't just warmth. Fire wasn't just protection. Fire wasn't just technology. It was identity. The flame was the heart of the camp, the one thing humans could rely on in a world where nothing else stayed the same. And yes, fire was the original multi-tool with a death option. Use it wisely, or you'll find out why the warning label should read, "Brilliant for survival, disastrous for everything else." For most of the Ice Age, human shelters were the architectural equivalent of "don't get too attached." Camps were built quickly, used briefly, and abandoned without ceremony, because when your main neighbours were glaciers and migrating herds, staying in one place long enough to decorate was a luxury you could not afford. Mobility was survival, and anything permanent was just extra weight waiting to slow you down, betray you, or collapse during a storm. But as the Ice Age ended and the world melted into something more unpredictable, humans found themselves returning to the same places again and again. Not because the land was stable, it absolutely wasn't, but because certain regions became dependable in their own inconsistent way. Food sources shifted, animals moved differently, rivers formed new paths, and forests sprang up, but some spots delivered enough resources to justify revisiting them every year. This didn't mean settling down. That phrase implies intention, comfort, or commitment. Early humans were not making mortgages, they were squatting strategically. The rise of the semi-permanent shelter. The first major shift was that shelters began lasting longer, weeks, months, sometimes even seasons. Instead of dismantling everything when they moved, people began constructing sturdier structures that could withstand weather changes and the occasional rude wildlife visitor. Materials varied. Mammoth bones and hides in the north wooden frames and bark panels in forested regions, stone circles or walls in rocky landscapes, reed and thatch constructions near wetlands. Shelters were no longer simple windbreaks. They became engineered spaces with shaped entrances, insulated walls, internal fire pits, and storage nooks for food or tools. But even these weren't homes. They were stations, stopping points on a yearly loop. You didn't stay forever. You stayed until the season told you to stop pretending it was safe. Seasonal rounds, the prehistoric travel schedule. Different seasons delivered different foods, and this predictable unpredictability carved informal migration circuits into human life. Spring meant certain plants and animals. Summer brought others. Autumn offered another wave of resources. Winter brought suffering, but at least you knew where the suffering would occur. So groups began returning to the same good spots each year. A river crossing rich in fish, a meadow where herds reliably passed, a grove that produced edible nuts, a cliff shelter that blocked wind and gathered sunlight. These places became the first anchors of human geography. They weren't permanent settlements, but they were familiar, dependable, and worth maintaining. If someone unfamiliar stumbled into your seasonal camp, you didn't claim ownership. You simply muttered, "We were here first," and hoped they understood the unspoken rules. Maintenance. The first chores nobody enjoyed. Because shelters were no longer single-use, people began investing effort into upkeep. You patched roofs, you reinforced walls, you redug fire pits, you rebuilt windbreaks that inevitably fell during storms. This was the birth of maintenance work, an activity that has burdened humanity ever since. You performed repairs not because you wanted to, but because returning next season to a collapsed hut filled with raccoon droppings was deeply demoralizing. The unexpected problem: animals also loved your camp. A semi-permanent shelter was not just attractive to you, it was attractive to every creature seeking an upgrade. Returning to camp might mean discovering that. Wolves had raised pups in your old sleeping area. Bears used your fire pit as a scratching spot. Birds nested in your roof. Rodents turned your entire storage corner into a theme park. You didn't settle down. You arrived and negotiated occupancy. Storage. The first attempt at thinking ahead. Storing food was a delicate art in Chapter 10. But even before that, people stashed non-food items in seasonal camps. Extra stone tools, spare firewood bones for toolmaking, heavy hides too annoying to carry. The idea was simple. Leave heavy things now, use them later. It was prehistoric convenience and prehistoric risk. You never knew whether the next group, human or non-human, would respect your stash. But when your tools were still there the next season, that was victory. That was a moment of joy. That was sustainable laziness paying off. Structural innovation, from huddles to homes-ish. With longer stays came experimentation. Humans improved shelter designs, sunken floors to trap warmth, stone foundations for stability, double-layered hides for insulation, wind-blocking walls arranged deliberately, not randomly, centralized hearths for heating and cooking. These weren't full-time houses, but they were prototypes, early architectural ambition expressed through necessity, not aesthetics. You weren't building monuments, you were building, please don't fall on me during the night structures. Community shape shifts. Longer stays meant more consistent social patterns. Camps developed designated sleeping areas, cooking zones formed around shared fires, middens, trash piles, accumulated, becoming archaeological gold mines. Meeting spaces naturally emerged. People knew where others would be during certain seasons. Alliances developed. Traditions grew. That cliff shelter you returned to year after year became a location of shared memories, shared meals, and shared arguments with your neighbours. The psychological shift, semi-permanent shelters provided something new: familiarity. In a world that changed constantly, returning to the same structure, even a simple hut, offered emotional stability. You remembered where the wind entered. You remembered where rain pooled. You remembered the rock you hit your knee on last year. It wasn't home, but it was recognizable, and that mattered more than comfort. The great irony: humans were nowhere near agriculture yet. They weren't domesticating animals. They weren't planting seeds intentionally. They weren't forming villages. But the foundations of sedentary life were being laid, in hides and bones and woven mats and reused hearths. They didn't settle down. They squatted strategically. And those strategic squats were the first quiet steps toward everything that would come later. For most of human existence, food was a right-now situation. You ate what you found, hunted, or scavenged. If you had leftovers, congratulations, today was good. If you didn't, also congratulations, you were normal. There was no pantry, no meal planning, no saving snacks for later. Your body didn't even trust the concept of later. But as the Ice Age ended and the world rearranged itself, humans stumbled into something revolutionary: food storage, drying meat, saving nuts, hiding emergency stashes underground, creating secret piles of food, and then spending the rest of the week checking on them nervously like a squirrel with trust issues. In other words, congratulations, you now worry about tomorrow. Why storage became necessary. Environmental changes didn't just transform forests and wetlands. They changed availability cycles. Some seasons produced a flood of resources, others delivered almost nothing. Humans finally had access to foods that spoiled fast, appeared suddenly, or arrived in overwhelming quantities. This abundance wasn't comforting, it was stressful. You could gather hundreds of berries in a day, only to watch them rot before you finished eating them. You could catch enough fish to feed the clan, only to realise you'd lose most of it by morning. The world was generous, but unpredictably so. So people adapted. They learned to save food not for a distant future, but for the next week, or the next moon, or the next bad stretch of weather. It wasn't long-term planning, it was short-term survival with an anxiety problem. Drying, humanity's first attempt at shelf life. Drying food was the easiest and most widespread method. Meat, fish, and sometimes even edible plants were cut thin, hung in the sun or smoke, and transformed from fresh delicacies into chewy, leathery, borderline offensive substances that lasted significantly longer. Dried meat didn't taste good, dried meat didn't chew well, but dried meat didn't rot, and that was the only metric that mattered. This was revolutionary. You could kill an animal today and eat it next week. You could prepare for a coming storm. You could travel without relying entirely on luck. You could feed children when hunting failed. Drying didn't eliminate starvation. It created a buffer. A tiny, precious buffer you guarded with your life. Caching. The art of hiding food from everyone, including yourself. Caching was the next great innovation. A cache was a hidden food stash buried underground, tucked into caves or wedged between rocks. It was brilliant in theory. It kept food cool. It protected food from spoilage. It stashed food where predators might not find it. It allowed you to return later and save yourself from disaster. However, there were problems. Big problems. Caches were only useful if you could remember where you put them. Humans had no maps, no GPS, and, most importantly, no guarantee that other animals didn't find the cache first. More than one early human likely spent a day digging frantically in the wrong patch of ground, insisting they buried a pile of dried meat somewhere right here, while the local fox population quietly smirked. Caches also attracted thieves. Not necessarily malicious humans, just opportunistic ones. If another group found your food, well, now it was their food. Congratulations. You now worry about tomorrow and about who else knows where your tomorrow is stored. Guarding food. The birth of prehistoric stress. Once humans began storing food, they had to protect it. This meant checking the drying racks constantly, guarding caches, building small barriers, moving food inside shelters, hanging food from trees to confuse animals that were smarter than you wanted to admit. Your day didn't end when you caught food. Your day ended when you stored it, secured it, and confirmed that nothing with claws, wings, teeth, or opposable thumbs had stolen it. And then, even after doing all that, you lay awake at night wondering whether you should check again. Storage changed the meaning of enough. Before storage, the only question was, do we have food today? After storage, a new question appeared, do we have food tomorrow? This subtle shift created an entirely new emotional landscape. Humans began worrying about time in a different way, not just this season or this migration, but this week, this month, this winter. Suddenly you weren't just surviving moment to moment, you were anticipating problems. You were imagining hunger before it arrived. You were planning for threats that hadn't happened yet. Congratulations, you now worry about tomorrow, and the day after that. The social side of storing food also transformed social relationships. Sharing became strategic instead of spontaneous. Leaders emerged who managed group stores. Arguments started over who ate too much or contributed too little. Trust became valuable because mistrust was exhausting. A group with well-managed food stores survived lean times. A group with mismanaged stores didn't. Storage created reliability, but it also created responsibility. and resentment. Risk and reward, the storage gamble. Keeping food was always a gamble. Rain could ruin drying racks, mold could infect stored nuts, animals could sniff out buried caches, humans could forget where things were hidden, fires could burn everything. But despite all these risks, storage was worth it. It extended survival. It reduced panic. It allowed humans to move more freely and adapt more effectively to their inconsistent world. Storage didn't solve the problem of hunger, but it gave humans a fighting chance against it. The big picture, anxiety as adaptation. The moment humans began storing food, they also began imagining the future. Even if the future looked bleak, even if it looked uncertain, it was no longer an abstract concept. It was something you could prepare for, even if preparing for it made you intensely nervous. Because now, for the first time, your hunger wasn't only about today. Your survival wasn't only about now. Your decisions mattered beyond the moment. And with that came the earliest, quietest, most universal human stress. Food storage didn't just change how humans ate. It changed how humans worried. Congratulations, you now worry about tomorrow. For most of the Ice Age, human groups were small, scattered, and blessed with something modern people dream about: abundant personal space. Camps were roomy. Distances between clans were vast. If you disliked someone, all you had to do was walk in literally any direction for 20 minutes and congratulations, you lived somewhere else now. But as the world warmed and survival became slightly less lethal, more people began living long enough to have children who also lived long enough to have more children. Populations rose, camps expanded, neighbouring groups bumped into one another more often, and the quiet, spacious solitude of the Ice Age slowly shrank into something recognisable to modern humans: crowding, noise, and absolutely zero privacy. The Ice Age ends. Personal space ends with it. Why people suddenly survived more. The late Ice Age and early Holocene brought just enough environmental stability for human survival rates to edge upward. Food was still a constant struggle, yes, but the worst glacial extremes were fading. Babies lived slightly longer. Adults survived slightly more injuries. Elder knowledge passed down more reliably. These small improvements compounded across generations until groups that once numbered 15 now numbered 40, or 60, or even 100. That may not sound like much, but when you all live in one camp, one valley, one shared landscape, those extra 50 humans feel like a population boom of cosmic proportions. And with more people comes more everything. More noise, more opinions, more disputes, more chores, more footprints scaring off animals, more awkward moments when you walk outside and someone is already using the bathroom bush. Suddenly, the world felt crowded, even though population densities were still extremely low by modern standards. Camps begin to feel like prehistoric apartment buildings. Crowded camps changed daily life. You couldn't ignore your neighbours anymore. You lived beside them, worked beside them, cooked beside them, and listened to their arguments whether you wanted to or not. Shelters might sit closer together than before. Fire pits needed to accommodate more people. Shared activities, like processing animal hides or preparing food, became communal out of necessity. And communal work meant communal tension. Every clan had that one person who talked too loud. That one person who always ate more than their share. That one person who snored like a mammoth stuck in a bog. And now there was no escaping them. More people. More conflict. Conflict was inevitable. Not because humans are naturally aggressive, but because food distribution became more complicated. Leadership became contested. Hunting strategies required more coordination. Opinions multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Groups bumped into other groups more frequently. Two clans might meet at a river crossing and ask the dreaded question, who gets to fish here first? Nobody wanted to fight, but everyone wanted dinner. Territorial disputes emerged, negotiations became necessary, trade networks formed, alliances appeared and dissolved. Humans were inventing politics long before chiefs or councils existed, out of pure necessity. The more people in your group, the more you needed rules, boundaries, and someone to enforce them. Noise levels reach historical highs for the time. More people in camp meant more sound. Crying infants, barking dogs. Yes, dogs existed, and yes, they barked. People laughing, arguing, singing, or telling stories late into the night, hammering stone tools, scraping hides, children running everywhere except where they were supposed to be. Silence became a rare commodity. And with noise came stress. Hunters who used to stalk animals in calm, small groups now had to navigate the chaos of a community with 20 distractions at any given moment. Privacy was so limited that the idea of alone time didn't exist. You could walk away from camp, sure, but someone would inevitably ask where you were going and whether you planned to bring something back for the group. Social friction, humanity learns the art of tolerating each other. Living in larger groups required entirely new skills: patience, for when someone told the same story again; diplomacy, for when you wanted to yell but yelling would cause a fight; compromise, for when everyone needed the same tool at once; cooperation, for when hunting required teamwork instead of lone wolf heroism; selective hearing, for when you pretended not to hear someone's terrible suggestions. Humans evolved socially during this era, not through biology, but through practice. Daily practice. Forced practice. The kind of practice that comes from waking up next to the same 30 people every day and knowing you cannot move unless all 30 agree it's time. When populations grow, roles multiply. Larger groups needed structure. Not strict leadership yet, but emerging roles: skilled hunters, expert tool makers, knowledge keepers, mediators, fire tenders, gatherers, scouts, child minders. Division of labour became sharper because efficiency was crucial. One person becoming good at making spears meant another could focus on tracking. Someone developing a talent for gathering plants freed others to plan the next move. These roles reduced chaos but also created a new level of interdependence that, while beneficial, introduced fresh opportunities for arguments. If the fire tender fell asleep on the job, everyone froze. If the toolmaker produced a bad spear, everyone ate poorly. If the storyteller forgot the ending to a cherished myth, everyone groaned. More people meant more specialization and more pressure on each individual not to mess up. Intergroup encounters, cooperation and clashes. As populations grew, humans inevitably interacted more with outsiders. Some encounters led to trade: stone, shells, pigments, tools. Others led to alliances, shared hunts, or even marriages between groups. But not all meetings were friendly. Overlapping territories created competition. Misunderstandings sparked hostilities. And with more people needing more food, clashes sometimes became unavoidable. This wasn't constant warfare, it was intermittent tension, a dance of diplomacy, avoidance, and occasional yelling. But it marked the beginning of a world where strangers were no longer rare. The psychological impact, the end of quiet living. Imagine spending millennia in small, quiet family groups, then suddenly finding yourself in a proto-village. Humans needed to adjust emotionally to living with people they didn't choose and to staying near them for entire seasons. Some adapted easily, some adapted reluctantly, some adapted while muttering under their breath. But the shift had begun. Humanity was drifting, slowly but unmistakably, from wandering bands toward clustered communities. The Ice Age ends. Personal space ends with it, and humanity begins learning the complicated, exhausting, and ultimately transformative skill of living together. As the Ice Age ended, and the environment transformed into a patchwork of forests, wetlands, rivers, and newly unpredictable landscapes, humans discovered something very inconvenient. Their old tools, so reliable for hunting giant animals on open plains, was suddenly about as useful as a blunt spoon in a sword fight. The world had changed. The prey had changed, the plants had changed, the terrain had changed, and so humans did what humans do best. They upgraded. Your toolkit updates, the bugs remain. Microliths, the prehistoric equivalent of switching to apps. One of the biggest innovations of this era was the rise of microliths, tiny, carefully shaped stone blades designed to be combined into composite tools. Instead of relying on one big, heavy stone point, hunters now use several small, precise ones inserted into a wooden or bone shaft. Think of microliths as the modular design phase of human prehistory. Microliths allowed for lightweight spear tips, arrowheads, cutting edges, harpoon barbs, serrated tools. A single microlith wasn't impressive by itself, but dozens, crafted and slotted into different handles, allowed humans to create a Swiss Army knife's worth of new gear. Why small? Because the world was shifting towards smaller prey, denser vegetation, and more intricate tasks. Precision mattered, speed mattered, carrying something that weighed less than a toddler mattered. Microliths also had another advantage: easy replacement. If a big spear point broke, you cried and made a new one over several days. If a microlith broke, you sighed, replaced the tiny piece, and moved on with your life. Fishing gear, the new frontier of not starving. With rising temperatures came expanding wetlands, richer rivers, and coastlines that finally thawed enough to support aquatic life. Fish became a major food source, and humans responded by inventing a whole suite of tools: barbed bone harpoons, fish hooks carved from antler, weighted nets made from plant fibers, basket traps placed in shallow water, spears specifically shaped for stabbing slippery things. Fishing required patience, skill, and the ability to stand very still while bugs treated you like an all-you-can-eat buffet. But it paid off. Unlike many land animals, fish didn't run away the moment they saw you. They simply swam in circles, oblivious to the fact that humans had just invented sharp, pointy water weapons. Still, technology could only do so much. If you stood in the wrong river bend, you caught nothing. If you stood in the right river bend, you caught dinner. And no matter what, you caught mosquito bites. Many, many mosquito bites. Your toolkit updates. The bugs remain. Grinding stones. Early humanity meets carbs. The end of the Ice Age brought new plants into the world. Grasses with edible seeds, nuts with shells so stubborn they could crush optimism, and tubers that required more processing than you'd think any food was worth. To handle all this botanical opportunity, humans invented grinding stones. Grinding stones allowed people to crush seeds, break apart husks, make coarse flour, process nuts, turn tough plant matter into something vaguely digestible. These stones were heavy, awkward, and a chore to carry around, but they opened the door to a new category of foods that didn't run away or hide in trees. Grinding meant calories, and calories meant survival. It also meant time. Grinding plant material is the opposite of glamorous. Hours spent shoving seeds into a rock trough and pulverizing them didn't feel heroic, but it kept people alive. And once grinding became common, it spread everywhere because even the most stubborn human eventually discovers the joy of not chewing unprocessed seeds for 40 straight minutes. Scrapers, awls, and needles. Clothing gets complicated. As the climate grew inconsistent, clothing needed to be more adaptable. This meant more sewing, more shaping, and more processing of hides and plant fibers. Enter scrapers for softening hides, awls for poking holes, needles made of bone, antler, or sharpened wood. These tools allowed humans to create fitted garments instead of simple draped furs. Cloaks became more flexible. Footwear became sturdier. Clothing could now be tailored to match the demands of forests, wetlands, storms, or the unrelenting insult of a sudden sunny day. Carving tools. The rise of wooden technology. Stone tools were great, but wood opened new possibilities. Wooden handles, spear shafts, baskets, digging sticks, fish traps, bow staves, and even early containers, all required specialized carving tools. Stone blades that were thin, sharp, and precisely angled allowed humans to carve more effectively than ever before. This sparked a quiet technological revolution in woodworking, giving rise to tools that were lighter and easier to replace than their all-stone predecessors. This woodworking boom was also directly tied to microliths, small stone inserts used to create composite knives, saws, and cutting edges. For the first time, humans could construct tools that truly matched their environment. Glue, resin, and early adhesives. Stickiness saves the day. With composite tools came the need to stick pieces together. Humans learned to heat pine resin, mix it with charcoal or powdered stone, apply it as early superglue to secure microliths. This was delicate, messy work that sometimes resulted in a perfectly crafted tool, and sometimes resulted in sticky hands, ruined materials, and a strong desire to yell at a tree. But adhesives allowed humans to make multi-component weapons, traps, and cutting tools. That made everything else easier. Specialization. The first tool experts. As tool complexity grew, so did specialization. Not everyone had the same skill. Some people became master knappers, expert carvers, skilled net makers, precision microlith manufacturers, resin mixers, grinding stone operators. These individuals became essential to the group. Their tools kept everyone alive, and their knowledge had to be passed down carefully. If your master toolmaker got sick, your entire clan panicked a little. Technological skill became a survival asset more valuable than strength. But no matter how advanced tools became, there was always one constant: bugs. Fishing tools didn't scare them. Grinding stones didn't stop them. Clothing needles didn't defend you. Fire helped a bit, but only a bit. Humans were getting smarter, sharper, and more technologically innovative. But the insects of the warming world, they thrived. Your toolkit updates, the bugs remain, and humanity pushed onward anyway. By the end of the Ice Age, the world had entered its soggy era. Melting glaciers carved out rivers, filled depressions into lakes, and expanded coastlines into vast aquatic buffets. Suddenly, humans encountered a strange and wonderful truth. The water was full of food. Food that did not sprint. Food that did not leap into trees. Food that did not bolt into burrows the instant you sneezed. Fish were not easier. They were simply indifferent. They swam in circles, minding their own business, unaware that humans had reached a point of hunger where staring intensely at water felt like a legitimate hunting strategy. You stare at water until it feeds you. Rivers, nature's moving pantry. Rivers during the late Ice Age weren't the narrow channels we imagine today. Many were wide, braided networks of streams bursting with sediment, nutrients, and, most importantly, fish. Salmon runs, trout migrations, and seasonal spawning events provided humans with predictable seafood opportunities. If you timed it right, you had protein for days. If you timed it wrong, well, you got practice. Fishing in rivers required more than luck. Humans positioned themselves near rapids, shallow bends, or narrow channels where fish had fewer escape routes. They fashioned bone-tipped harpoons, long wooden spears, and eventually hooks made from antler or sharpened bone. These tools gave them reach, precision, and a fighting chance against animals whose only defense strategy was swim faster. Still, the river did not always cooperate. Sometimes it provided abundance. Other times it gave you a long afternoon of wet feet and disappointment. Lakes, calm water, chaotic fishing. Post-glacial lakes were enormous. Some stretched for miles, fed by meltwater and stocked with fish that adapted to their new environments almost overnight, evolutionarily speaking. For humans, these lakes were both blessing and challenge. Blessing, enormous quantities of fish. Challenge, enormous quantities of water between you and the fish. Lake fishing required new techniques. Humans built basket traps submerged near shore, long spears for shallow ambushes, weighted nets woven from plant fibres, hooks attached to sinew or tough reeds. They also learned the art of standing incredibly still. Fish avoided movement, shadows, and splashes, which meant fishing often involved planting your feet in mud and pretending to be a tree for long stretches of time. Insects swarmed your face, water numbed your legs, birds mocked you. And still you stood, waiting for the brief moment when a fish ventured close enough to strike. It was a test of patience, skill, and the ability to ignore how cold your ankles were. Coastlines, the buffet at the edge of the world. As ice retreated and sea levels rose, coastlines transformed into rich, constantly shifting ecosystems. Here, humans encountered not just fish, but shellfish, crustaceans, seabirds, seals, and edible seaweed. Coastal foraging, unlike lake or river fishing, could produce food even on bad days. Clams, mussels, and limpets did not flee. They clung to rocks and waited for someone to pry them off. Seaweed drifted to shore. Crabs hid under stones but could be coaxed out with enough persistence. This abundance turned coastlines into seasonal hotspots. Groups travelled far to reach them, carrying tools designed specifically for prying, scooping, and hauling. Over time, coastal diets became some of the most varied and nutritious of the entire era. And yet, even here, fishing required patience. Humans learned to watch tides, read waves, and predict when fish would appear in shallow tidal pools. Success depended not just on tools, but on timing. If you arrived too early, the tide stranded you on dry sand. If you arrived too late, the tide tried to drown you. If you arrived at the right moment, dinner practically walked into your hands. The psychology of waiting. Fishing as a mental endurance test. Hunting required bursts of energy. Gathering required movement. Fishing required something far more challenging. Stillness. It wasn't glamorous stillness either. It was the type of quiet focus where your legs ached, your back cramped, your stomach growled, and a fish you'd been watching for 30 minutes casually swam away as if to insult your entire bloodline. Fishing became a training ground for patience. You waited for shadows under the water. You waited for the right angle of sunlight. You waited for the fish to drift close. You waited even longer because it turned at the last second. You stared at water until it fed you. This was the contract. Humans accepted it. Fishing changes, diet and tools. With more fish came nutritional benefits. Omega-3 fatty acids, protein and fat, improved brain function, endurance, and overall health. Communities near rivers and coastlines often grew faster, lived longer, and had more consistent food access than inland groups. Fishing also spurred tool innovation. Hooks became more refined. Nets developed weighted edges. Harpoons gained barbs. People invented floats and sinkers. Basket traps became more elaborate. Every new tool increased efficiency, and every new tool required practice. You didn't become a master fisher overnight. You learned by missing, by falling into the water, by realizing you stood in the wrong part of the river for an entire afternoon. Fishing as community effort. Because fishing wasn't about brute strength, everyone could contribute. Children caught small fish near shore. Adults built nets and traps. Elders taught timing and technique. Skilled fishers scouted new spots. Groups coordinated drives in shallow waters. Fishing brought people together in a shared, quiet, hopeful endurance ritual, followed by cheering when someone finally caught something edible. When fishing fails, even with abundant lakes and rivers, failure was part of the routine. Weather changed. Water levels rose or fell. Fish migrated unpredictably. Nets tore. Hooks broke. A shadow spooked an entire school. You returned to camp with nothing but wet clothes and a damp sense of shame. But failure didn't discourage humans. It motivated them. The promise of reliable aquatic food pushed communities to refine techniques, invent new tools, and explore new waters. Fishing was not just a survival method. It was a relationship with water, with patience, and with the hope that eventually something would bite. You stare at water until it feeds you, and somehow, miraculously, it does. Modern people often imagine prehistoric migration as a bold, heroic march into the unknown, humans bravely striding across continents with confidence, courage, and excellent posture. The reality: migration was rarely an inspiring adventure. It was a stressed, often panicked shuffle, driven by necessity, hunger, changing landscapes, and the realization that your familiar valley had just turned into a bog, your river changed direction, and your dinner had decided to live 300 miles away. You didn't explore, you fled politely. Animals move first, humans scramble. After the first and most important rule of Ice Age migration was simple: where the animals go, you go. Animals weren't just decoration in prehistoric life. They were food, clothing, tools, and, unintentionally, navigation systems. When herds shifted their routes in response to warming weather, new vegetation, or just a collective whim, humans had no choice but to follow. If reindeer moved north, you moved north. If bison shifted east, you shifted east. If small game suddenly preferred wetlands, you developed a personal relationship with mud. Migration wasn't bravery, it was survival. You packed what you could carry, took a deep breath, and trudged behind the creatures that kept you alive, all while hoping they didn't change their minds again. Plants pull humans across the map. Animals weren't the only movers. Plants, slow, silent, and stubborn, shifted their growing zones as temperatures rose. Edible roots, berries, nuts, and herbs migrated northward or upward in elevation, sprouting where they'd never sprouted before and disappearing from places your grandparents swore they had always grown. This created awkward conversations. We'll gather berries here. There are no berries here. But there were berries here. Yes, that was before the berries left. So humans followed the berries, the nuts, the greens, and the wild grains. Plant migration wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless. And when the food moves, so do you. Melting corridors, the land opens, then closes again. One of the biggest drivers of migration was the opening of new land passages. As ice sheets retreated, enormous swaths of terrain emerged. Fresh valleys, soft plains, and coastlines previously buried under ice. These were brand new opportunities, like the planet revealing secret rooms it had been hiding for millennia. Humans moved into these corridors eagerly, not because they were brave, but because they needed space, food, and the chance to escape the chaos behind them. But melting corridors came with a catch. They didn't stay stable. A path that existed one generation might flood the next. A valley that once led to prime hunting grounds might become a lake. A shoreline that offered resources might drown under rising seas. Imagine trying to build a mental map when the map reorganized itself every few centuries. Migration wasn't an event. It was a continuous adjustment to the Earth's refusal to stop rearranging the furniture. Coastlines, the world's most enticing, most temporary highways. As sea levels rose, coastlines shifted dramatically, but before many were submerged, they served as excellent migration routes. Flat ground, abundant food, predictable pathways. Coasts were the highways of prehistory. Families followed shorelines for hundreds, even thousands of miles. But the ocean had no interest in keeping these paths available. 1 century, the beach stretches endlessly. A few centuries later, it's gone, claimed by the sea without apology. This forced humans to constantly recalculate their routes, sometimes pushing entire populations inland, other times forcing them into tighter coastal pockets where competition escalated. Crowding pushes groups outward. Growing populations didn't just create noisy camps, they created pressure. Too many people in one region meant fewer resources, more arguments, and the sudden realization that there were friendlier places to be. Sometimes migration happened peacefully, A group simply decided that greener pastures existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Other times, migration happened because staying meant dealing with your loudest, most annoying neighbours daily. Humans expanded outward, not because they were adventurous, but because the alternative was living in someone else's personal space bubble indefinitely, and that bubble had burst centuries ago. Climate mood swings force relocation. Weather didn't just change over centuries, it changed within decades. Sudden cooling periods, unexpected droughts, or rapid shifts in rainfall patterns could turn a once reliable home into a region best described as inhospitable with a side of despair. One year your valley is abundant, the next it's dry and empty. The year after that it's full of plants, but the wrong plants. You migrate not because it's noble, but because staying would make survival statistically hilarious. Travel isn't a quest, it's a burden. We often glamorize migration as though people pack their bags with optimism and enthusiasm. In reality, prehistoric migration meant carrying everything you owned, walking until your feet hated you, losing your favourite landmarks, hoping your children could keep up, hoping your elders survived the journey, hoping the new land wasn't worse than the old one. Every move was a gamble, and yet humans made these gambles repeatedly because the alternative, staying put while the world changed around them, was worse. Migration creates cultural exchange and tension. As groups moved, they encountered other migrating groups. Sometimes this resulted in trade new tools, shared knowledge, intermarriage combined hunting strategies. Other times it resulted in very tense negotiations, mutually agreed avoidance, hostile shouting, throwing projectiles that were definitely not meant as gifts. Migration didn't just move people across land, it moved ideas, languages, and innovations with them. The world became interconnected long before agriculture or cities existed. You don't explore, you flee politely. The truth about migration at the end of the Ice Age is simple. No one was discovering new lands. They were running from old ones, running from hunger, from crowding, from climate shifts, from disappearing animals, from rising seas, from failing resources, and yet, humans made it look effortless. They travelled astonishing distances, crossed mountains, rivers, and ice barriers, and adapted to every environment the planet invented. Not because they were fearless, because they were determined. You don't explore, you flee politely, and somehow the world opens before you. If you lived more than 10,000 years ago, you didn't need a dramatic tsunami or a monstrous tidal wave to lose everything you knew. All you needed was time, steady, silent, implacable time, and the slow, unstoppable rise of the world's oceans. One generation set up camp on a beautiful coastline, rich with fish, birds, and edible plants. A few generations later, that same coastline was gone, swallowed by the sea so gradually that no one could agree on the exact moment land officially became water. Your childhood home is now a fish. The Great Meltwater Flood. As the Ice Age ended, massive ice sheets melted. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but continuously. Each summer brought slightly more meltwater. Each century added more to the global oceans. What looked like a harmless rise of an inch or two became, across centuries, a rise of over 100 meters. This wasn't a dramatic nightmare. It was worse. It was subtle. People noticed shorelines creeping inland. Rivers changing their shapes, marshes forming in what used to be dry land. But everything happened slowly enough that humans adapted without ever naming the problem. A beach where your family once gathered shellfish, now underwater. A headland that once held sacred carvings, vanished beneath the waves. A valley where generations camped every summer, drowned forever. Communities didn't flee in terror. They simply kept moving their camps higher, season after season, until one day they realized the sea had taken not just the beach, but the entire memory of a place. Lost camps and sunken worlds. Archaeologists today face an enormous problem. Most of human coastal history is sitting under hundreds of feet of seawater. The richest, busiest, most resource-filled areas humans lived in during the late Ice Age weren't inland. They were along coasts. Those were the highways of travel, the hubs of trade, the densest settlements, and the most reliable food zones. And now, they're gone. All the camps, shelters, hearths, tools, and discarded bones that would tell us how people lived are hidden on submerged continental shelves. If you've ever wondered why archaeologists know less about coastal Ice Age life than inland life, it's because the sea walked off with the evidence. Imagine thousands of campsites, one for each migration season, spread across millennia. Entire histories, erased not by catastrophe, but by geography quietly changing shape. For every site we find inland, dozens more lie beneath waves, mud, reefs, and silt. Flooded rivers, lost paths. Rivers didn't just lose their banks, they often lost themselves. Meltwater carved new channels, erased ancient ones, and flooded lowlands far beyond today's river systems. People who'd followed the same fishing routes for generations suddenly found their landmarks rearranged or drowned. The river you grew up beside isn't gone, just relocated several kilometers away without filing any paperwork. Old trails vanished, new lakes formed, former meadows turned into deltas filled with reeds and mosquitoes. Navigation became a guessing game. Your grandparents described paths that no longer existed, and your children grew up assuming those stories were exaggerated. Memory itself began to drown. Sacred places sink beneath the waves. People didn't just lose hunting grounds, they lost meaning. Caves with artwork, burial platforms, ritual sites, and places where clans gathered for trading or storytelling all disappeared as sea levels rose. Imagine your lineage telling stories for generations about a revered site you will never see because it now sits beneath 30 meters of cold ocean water. Entire mythologies likely drowned, entire genealogies, entire traditions. We know this because the rare underwater archaeological discoveries, stone tools, hearth remnants, even submerged forests, hint at worlds we once inhabited but can never fully recover. The ocean isn't just deep, it's secretive. Why archaeology is missing so much evidence? Modern researchers face several challenges when trying to reconstruct this era. Underwater excavation is extremely difficult. The ocean buries sites under layers of silt and sand that can be dozens of meters thick. Organic remains decay faster underwater. Bones, wood, leather, everything rots unless perfectly preserved. The exact shorelines of the past are often unknown. Coastlines shifted gradually, unevenly, and irregularly. Most preserved sites lie far offshore, and you can't just casually dig there with a shovel. This is why the prehistoric coastal world often feels invisible. It isn't gone, it's hiding, and it may always hide. People didn't notice the disaster because it was slow. The most fascinating part of this transformation is that it wasn't experienced as a crisis. Humans didn't wake up one morning screaming, "The sea stole the entire village!" They noticed little things. A favourite campsite now too soggy to use. A shellfish bed slightly harder to reach. A river mouth shifting year after year. A dry path becoming a muddy marsh. Step by step, season by season, the world crept inland. People moved their belongings a little higher. Then a little higher again, and again. The shoreline vanished so slowly that most generations assumed this was simply normal. Only long-term memory reveals the scale of what was lost. Pieces of human history swallowed by rising seas, not violently, but indifferently. A moving world, a moving people. As the sea advanced, humans adapted. They became more mobile, more flexible, and more creative. They rebuilt camps on higher ground. They found new freshwater sources. They changed their fishing strategies. They followed coastlines that no longer stayed still. The planet was remodeling itself, and people simply did what they had always done. They moved with it. Their stories survived even when their landscapes didn't. Their resilience endured even as their homes drowned. But the archaeology? Well, let's just say a huge portion of our past is now chilling with the clams. Your childhood home is now a fish, and the ocean doesn't give it back. When humans lived in tiny Ice Age bands of maybe a dozen people, social rules were simple. Don't steal food, don't annoy the best hunter, and try very hard not to set the shelter on fire. But as populations grew, landscapes shifted, and resources required ever more cooperation, the unwritten rules of society evolved into something more intricate, more delicate, and occasionally more exhausting. Power dynamics emerged. Sharing became strategic. Disputes needed referees. And diplomacy, yes, diplomacy, became a survival skill. Survival now requires diplomacy. Cooperation becomes mandatory, not optional. In small groups, cooperation was natural. Everyone knew everyone. And surviving meant working together automatically. But once groups expanded, doubling, tripling, merging seasonally with neighbours, cooperation stopped being instinctual. It became an organised effort. Tasks multiplied. Coordinated hunts involving dozens of people, large-scale plant gathering that needed teamwork, building and repairing shelters for longer-term stays, smoke curing, drying racks, and food processing in quantities never seen before, all of this required structure. People learned to specialise and rely on each other in ways they never had before, and with specialisation came the need to negotiate who did what, when, and why. Sharing norms, the delicate art of not hoarding everything. Sharing had always existed, but in denser groups it became socially policed. If someone refused to share meat or hoarded dried foods, the consequences weren't just interpersonal, they were survival level. Rules emerged. Successful hunters shared with the entire group. Gatherers distributed food according to need. Tools were borrowed, but with accountability. Firewood gathering rotated. People who refused to share weren't just rude, they were dangerous. One selfish individual could destabilize group cohesion. This created pressure to appear generous even when you weren't feeling generous. You might be starving, but if you pulled a surprisingly large fish out of the river, everyone expected you to share it immediately. Fail to do so, and you risked being labelled that person, the prehistoric equivalent of someone who brings nothing to a potluck but takes leftovers home. Leadership begins to take shape, usually reluctantly. Before, decisions were made informally by elders or the most skilled hunters, but now groups needed people who could coordinate hunts, resolve disputes, organise movement between seasonal camps, ensure fair distribution of resources, manage relations with neighbouring groups, and, importantly, stop petty arguments before they escalated into someone throwing a stone. Leaders weren't kings. They weren't chiefs yet either. They were situational authorities, people who earned respect because they were calm, wise, persuasive, or just too tired to tolerate chaos anymore. Leadership often rotated. A brilliant hunter might lead hunts but have no authority in social matters. A respected elder might guide discussions but not organise travel. Authority was fluid, contextual, and heavily dependent on competence in that moment. If you led well, people listened. If you didn't, people quietly ignored you and pretended they didn't hear. Conflict resolution, the first prehistoric HR department. With more people came more conflict. Arguments arose over food portions, hunt failures, sleeping spots, tool ownership, who ruined the hide scraper, who stole whose drying rack space, or who said what about whose cousin during last night's fire gathering. Early humans needed conflict resolution strategies because fighting constantly would doom the group. They didn't have written laws. What they had were social expectations, public discussions, and older members who acted as mediators. Common strategies included public airing of grievances with the group acting as judge mediation by respected elders, temporary separation, go cool off behind that rock, gift-giving to soothe tensions, storytelling as an indirect way to criticize without naming names, shared tasks to rebuild trust. You two gather firewood together until you stop arguing. Physical fights still happened, of course, but they were costly, dangerous, and discouraged. A group couldn't afford to lose members to internal conflict. Diplomacy kept everyone fed. Group survival dynamics. Everyone depends on everyone. As societies became more complex, survival became a web rather than a simple line. Each person's role mattered. Hunters provided meat. Gatherers ensured daily calories. Toolmakers kept everyone equipped. Fire tenders preserved warmth and cooking capacity. Watchers guarded camps at night. Elders held knowledge of migrations, seasons, and safe zones. Young people supplied energy and labour. If one link in the chain broke, everyone suffered. This interdependence fostered deeper social bonds, but also deeper social obligations. People had to navigate relationships carefully because one falling out could ripple outward and weaken the entire group. You couldn't simply dislike someone privately. You had to manage that dislike diplomatically, because you might need to depend on them tomorrow. Rituals and shared norms keep the peace. With bigger groups came rituals to reinforce unity. Communal meals, shared storytelling, seasonal ceremonies, symbolic gestures of cooperation, initiation rites for young hunters or gatherers, collective decisions about when to move to new territories. These weren't just spiritual, they were social glue. They created identity, smoothed tensions, and reminded people that they were part of something larger than their own hunger or irritation. Prehistoric rituals often involved singing, dancing, symbolic objects, or storytelling performances around the fire. They were emotional resets, a way to reaffirm bonds before heading into another season of unpredictable weather, food worries, and environmental challenges. Diplomacy becomes a survival skill. Diplomacy wasn't optional. It was as essential as hunting or tool-making. Good negotiators made peace with neighbouring groups, avoided conflict over territory, and coordinated joint hunts when resources were abundant. Diplomacy also worked internally. A skilled speaker could diffuse tension, calm disputes, and remind everyone that cooperation was the only way to survive. In this era, diplomatic talent was just as valuable as physical strength. A single, well-timed sentence could prevent disaster. Let's talk about this became one of humanity's earliest, most life-saving strategies. When social rules get complicated, humans adapt. As Ice Age simplicity gave way to Holocene complexity, humans rose to the challenge. They built social systems flexible enough to handle population growth, environmental change, and constant uncertainty. They invented norms, roles, rituals, and expectations, not because they wanted structure, but because they needed it. Life became more crowded, more political, more emotional, but also more connected. Survival now requires diplomacy, and in learning diplomacy, humans took one of their first major steps towards civilization. If there is one universal truth about prehistoric survival, it's this. Every time the environment changes, humans immediately disagree on what everyone is supposed to do about it. As the Ice Age ended, landscapes transformed, diets diversified, and technology advanced. Gender roles, once shaped by a world of megafauna, long hunts, and freezing conditions, began shifting in ways that were subtle, inconsistent, and deeply confusing. Everyone adapts. Nobody agrees how. The old system meets a new world. During the harshest glacial periods, labour roles tended to follow predictable patterns. Dangerous megafauna required coordinated group hunts, often skewing toward individuals trained for long-distance travel, heavy speared confrontations, and high-risk encounters. Meanwhile, the gathering of plants, childcare, and shelter management required equally essential, but different, skills and time commitments. These old patterns weren't arbitrary. They were optimized for a brutally cold, resource-scarce world. But with warming climates came New plant species smaller, faster animals, wetlands full of aquatic food forests requiring different foraging strategies, emerging technologies, microliths, nets, grinding stones. Suddenly, the old performative scripts didn't apply. Human roles flexed, stretched, and sometimes twisted into shapes no one expected. Women take on expanded foraging and processing roles. The explosion of plant diversity meant that gathering transformed from a steady background task into a major skilled undertaking. Seasonal abundance needed timing, botanical knowledge, and precise identification. Mistakes could be deadly. Poisonous lookalikes existed everywhere, and mushrooms were basically nature's practical jokes. Women, who already held deep generational knowledge of plant life, expanded their expertise into processing nuts with grinding stones, extracting edible roots from forest floors, drying fruits and seeds for storage, monitoring seasonal growth cycles, identifying medicinal plants, weaving baskets and nets for transport and trapping. Gathering became an increasingly technical role involving planning, engineering, and risk management. It was no longer just pick things off the ground. It was a crucial component of survival strategy. Men adapt to a world without giant animals, with megafauna disappearing and smaller game dominating the landscape. The old heroic spearman identity had to adjust. Chasing reindeer in open tundra had given way to stalking deer in dense forests, snaring rabbits, fishing in rivers, and navigating wetlands that actively tried to suck your footwear off. Men adopted quiet stalking techniques, cooperative net hunting, spear fishing in cold shallows, climbing skills for trapping forest birds, woodworking for making bows, arrows, and traps. The new hunting environment required patience, precision, and a good sense of humour about swamps. The masculine identity of endurance-based pursuit hunting didn't disappear, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. Fishing blurs old boundaries. Fishing, perhaps more than any other food source, blurred strict gender roles. It didn't require exceptional strength. It didn't require sprinting across landscapes. It required patience, timing, teamwork, the ability to stand very still without complaining. That made it accessible to everyone. Children collected shellfish. Women wove nets and set basket traps. Men used spears and harpoons in deeper waters. Elders taught the knowledge of tides, spawning seasons, and river shifts. All members of the group contributed, making fishing an equalizer that quietly dissolved old divisions. Toolmaking creates new specializations. As tools became more complex, microliths, bone needles, resin adhesives, grinding stones, people with fine motor skills and patience became invaluable. This type of work wasn't limited to one gender. It was practiced by those talented in shaping tiny stone blades, weaving fibres, carving accurate notches, mixing glues without gluing their own hands shut. Craftsmanship, not physical power, became central, and craftsmanship tends to ignore whatever tidy category society pretends to have. Childcare isn't a static job anymore. With growing populations and expanded camp structures, childcare shifted from being an individual responsibility to a group one. Older siblings, extended family members, and even respected elders shared the workload. This freed adults to participate in labour roles previously exclusive or heavily gendered. You needed hands everywhere. You shared children everywhere. You dealt with noise everywhere. Childcare blurred boundaries further by supporting flexible labour contributions across all adult members. Leadership begins to diversify. As social structures became more complex, leadership roles also shifted. Knowledge of plants, weather patterns, migration cycles, and toolmaking became as valuable as physical strength. This allowed individuals, regardless of gender, to emerge as advisors, mediators, or decision-makers. Some groups leaned toward consensus-based leadership. Some followed the oldest and wisest. Some appointed the most diplomatic person as negotiator. No two communities used identical systems, and none of them ran smoothly without arguments, but they worked well enough to keep humans alive. Environmental demands override gender expectations. In unpredictable climates, rigid roles were impractical. If a storm wiped out your drying racks, everyone rebuilt them. If a large animal wandered into camp, everyone grabbed a spear. If fish were running, everyone grabbed baskets and nets. Survival required flexibility, and flexibility cares nothing for ideology. Gender roles were never universal across societies, and they certainly weren't static. One group might rely heavily on men for long-distance scouting. Another might depend on women's knowledge to navigate seasonal plant cycles. One might prioritize male leadership. Another might revere older women as the memory keepers and strategists. Everyone adapts. Nobody agrees how. The human talent for improvisation. What truly defined this period wasn't who did what. It was how adaptable everyone became. The world was changing faster than any generation before them had witnessed, and people responded by breaking old patterns, inventing new ones, and negotiating labour through trial and error. Flexibility was survival. Cooperation was mandatory. Gender roles became a spectrum of responsibilities rather than fixed boxes. People fit into roles based on skill, personality, necessity, and circumstance, not tradition. The world kept shifting. Humans kept shifting with it. And through this messy, improvised, endlessly negotiated process, human society became more dynamic, more resilient, and more recognizable to us today. Everyone adapts. Nobody agrees how. But somehow, astonishingly, it works. If you told an Ice Age human that their distant descendants would rely on organized rows of plants growing in neat little fields, they would stare at you blankly, toss a berry into their mouth, and walk away. Farming, agriculture, managing plants on purpose, that sounded like the kind of future problem they would politely refuse to acknowledge. And yet, without realizing it, the humans living just after the Ice Age were already taking the first tiny, nervous steps toward plant cultivation, not intentionally, not systematically, not even confidently. You didn't invent farming. You hovered nervously over seeds. It begins with curiosity and mild desperation. As environments shifted and plant diversity exploded, humans found themselves confronted with an overwhelming buffet of roots, nuts, berries, and grains. Some were delicious, some were poisonous, some were nutritious, some may have caused hallucinations involving large talking elk. This new botanical world required attention. People began noticing certain plants grew better in certain soils. Disturbed ground sprouted edible greens. Seeds dropped near camp sometimes sprouted. Regularly visited gathering spots produced more food. Plants reappeared yearly, if not over-harvested. None of this was farming, but all of it was observation. The critical first step in every scientific revolution, including the unintentional one unfolding now. Humans watched plants with the alertness of someone who wasn't sure whether something was food, medicine, or a tragic mistake. The first experiments. Small, simple, and slightly chaotic people didn't plant fields. They planted possibilities, often without meaning to. Imagine someone gathering seeds, carrying them in a woven pouch, and spilling a handful near camp. Weeks later, sprouts appear. Coincidence? Maybe, but you'd take note. Or someone noticed that the place where they dug up edible tubers last year now produced even more tubers. A stroke of luck? Perhaps. But a pattern emerges. These were the earliest accidental experiments. Dropping seeds on disturbed soil, leaving fruit scraps near camp, replanting tubers after taking only part of the root clearing brush to encourage growth of certain greens, saving good seeds without knowing why. This was not yet agriculture. This was proto-agriculture at its most hesitant. Humans poking at the plant world and waiting to see if it reacted in a friendly or poisonous manner. Tending, without knowing. You're tending. As people observed plant cycles, they started helping certain plants along, not in structured rows but in practical, opportunistic ways, pulling competing weeds around a patch of edible plants, breaking up soil while digging, encouraging regrowth, discarding seeds in favourable places for later gathering, leaving young plants intact so they could mature, checking on certain plant patches regularly. This wasn't farming, it was plant encouragement, plant persuasion, plant flirting. Humans still gathered wildly, travelled far and relied on mobility, but they also began returning to specific places where plants reliably grew, and ensuring those places remained productive. The birth of managed landscapes. Without calling it management, humans began shaping their environments to support preferred foods. This included clearing small patches of forest to increase sunlight, burning dry grass to stimulate fresh growth, as explored earlier, scattering seeds unintentionally during food processing, disturbing soil in ways that favoured certain plant species. These changes could increase the yield of edible plants next season. People didn't fully understand why it worked. They only knew that certain actions seemed to result in more food next year. And in a world where starvation was always lurking, more food next year was a miracle worth repeating. Selective gathering. The first tiny step toward domestication. Gatherers naturally preferred the largest berries, the softest roots, the grains that were easiest to pick the nuts that cracked open without ruining your teeth. By repeatedly harvesting plants with desirable traits and leaving others behind, humans inadvertently selected for those traits. Over generations, this shaped plant populations long before anyone had the vocabulary to explain it. Imagine unknowingly domesticating a plant simply by being picky. No one said, "Let's breed better grains." They said, "This one's big, I'm taking it." And somewhere in those unconscious choices, agriculture started whispering its earliest hints. Why people didn't farm properly. Yet. Farming requires stability, staying in one place long enough to tend and harvest crops. But early Holocene humans were still nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving with seasons, animals, and environmental shifts. Their lifestyle made full-time agriculture impossible. But micro-experiments happened because humans returned seasonally to the same camps. Certain plant patches became reliable seeds, naturally sprouted along migration routes. Accidental planting rewarded curiosity. They weren't ready to settle, but they were ready to notice patterns. Emotional support plants, the new anxiety. When people realized that the plants they encouraged grew better, they started checking on them, frequently, maybe a little obsessively. Picture someone leaving camp early to see whether those seeds they dropped last month had sprouted, or a gatherer proudly pointing to a patch of berries growing exactly where they accidentally spilled a handful the previous season. Was it farming? No. Was it investment? Absolutely. Humans were becoming attached to plants, not spiritually, but strategically. These patches meant fewer hungry days. They represented hope, continuity, and the idea that tomorrow might not be a disaster. You didn't invent farming. You hovered nervously over seeds. In this transitional era, humans weren't yet planting fields or domesticating crops, but they were experimenting, observing, nudging nature gently, testing whether they could influence plant growth without fully understanding the implications. They lacked the intention of farmers, but possessed the curiosity of scientists and the desperation of people who knew that food was never guaranteed. Their hands touched the soil. Their eyes watched seedlings. Their minds began connecting invisible threads, not enough to settle down, but enough to plant the earliest hints of what would eventually reshape humanity. You didn't invent farming. You hovered nervously over seeds, and those seeds were already changing human history, quietly, subtly, one accidental planting at a time. For most of the Ice Age, time meant one thing: now. Now you hunt. Now you eat. Now you don't freeze. Yesterday mattered only as a story. tomorrow mattered only as a hope. Humans lived in a world where immediate survival swallowed long-term planning whole. But as the climate warmed, plants diversified, animals changed their migrations, and food storage became a real survival strategy. Something remarkable happened inside the human mind. People began thinking ahead. Not in the grand civilizational sense, not yet, but in quietly revolutionary ways. Now, next month does. Seasons become more than background weather. During the height of the Ice Age, every season was just a different flavour of cold. You didn't track subtle differences because there were none. But as temperatures shifted and landscapes diversified, each season began offering different plants, different fish patterns, different small game availability, different travel conditions, different dangers. Suddenly, when you moved mattered. When you gathered mattered. When you hunted mattered. People started recognizing signs. Budding plants marking early spring, gathering bird migrations, signaling certain fish runs, reddening leaves, warning of the last good harvest weeks, the first frost announcing good luck surviving the next few months. Seasonal awareness became a survival skill as important as building tools or tracking animals. Migration timing evolves into a calendar of necessity. Migration had always existed, but previously it was mostly reactive. You moved when the big animals moved. Now, with diverse resources and semi-permanent camps, humans had to schedule movement more carefully. You couldn't just wander. You had to time everything perfectly. Move too early, resources not ready. Move too late, resources gone or spoiled. Arrive at a river too soon, no fish. Arrive too late. Other groups already fished it empty. Every decision relied on reading environmental cues. Humans were building something astonishing, a mental calendar based on nature's behaviours. No writing, no clocks, no numbered days, just memories, patterns, and the quiet pressure of needing to be in the right place at the right time or face disaster. Lunar cycles, the first universal clock in the sky. The moon became the first timekeeping device shared across the human world. Why? Because it was. Reliable, predictable, visible from everywhere, obviously doing something. The moon's phases were perfect markers for fishing cycles, tidal patterns, reproductive cycles of certain animals, plant gathering windows, social or ritual events, timing journeys under night skies. Humans didn't yet call them months, but the concept was forming. The waxing and waning moon anchored time in a way nothing else could. Not weather, not seasons, not memory. People began saying things like, "We travel after the second full moon of warmth. We gather when the moon becomes thin again. We will meet when the bright moon returns." This wasn't yet a calendar, but it was a shared structure, a rhythm, a pattern that let humans plan instead of simply react. Planning. Ahead. A new cognitive leap with food storage, plant observation, and changing environments. Humans began conceptualizing time in ways entirely foreign to their Ice Age ancestors. This included anticipating scarcity, saving resources for future use, preparing for seasonal returns, teaching children when things would happen, not just what things were coordinating group tasks weeks in advance, making tools before they were needed, predicting animal migration, storing special materials during good seasons for bad ones. Planning ahead was more than strategy. It was a psychological shift. Yesterday mattered. Now next month does. Social time. When groups begin synchronizing. As camps grew and social rules expanded, timing became a collective experience. Groups needed to gather together at the same time, hunt in coordinated waves, move camps in unity, maintain shared rituals, decide as a community when seasons officially began. Different groups might define seasons differently based on local cues. Birds returning in one region, plant blooms in another, river thaw in a third. This created early cultural variations in timekeeping. But what mattered most? Agreement. Shared timing meant shared survival. Environmental signals become a language. Late Ice Age humans didn't predict time using abstract ideas. They predicted time using the angle of the sun, the colour of leaves, the smell of soil after rain, the calls of certain birds, the behaviour of insects, the height of rivers, the first frost creeping across the grass, the last ice melting from shaded rocks. Time wasn't separate from nature. Time was nature. Understanding time was understanding the environment, and the people who mastered this knowledge became invaluable guides and teachers. Memory expands across generations. A critical turning point in timekeeping came when people began storing generational knowledge, not physically, but orally. Elders told younger members, "When the moon is thin and the berries have not yet grown, do not travel north. When the days become longer and warmer, the animals return. When the river rises beyond the stones, gather fish downstream." This passed-on knowledge allowed future generations to predict events they had never personally experienced. Memory became a tool for forecasting. Forecasting became a tool for survival. And time became something humans could use. The emotional shift, living with anticipation. Once humans began thinking in weeks and months instead of days, a new emotional landscape unfolded. Anticipation, patience, anxiety, hope, waiting for seasonal food, waiting for fish runs, waiting for plant growth, waiting for stored food to last, waiting for migrations to begin. These were the earliest forms of long-term psychological investment. Time became heavy. Time became meaningful. Time became something you watched, not something that just happened to you. And so the world gets bigger through time. By measuring time differently, humans gained something revolutionary: the ability to coordinate actions with the future in mind. This cognitive evolution laid the groundwork for everything that would come later: agriculture, trade calendars, settlements, rituals, stories structured around past and future meaning that extended beyond a single-day survival. But for now, in this era, timekeeping was still humble, quiet, rooted in plants, moonlight, seasons, and survival. Yesterday mattered. Now, next month does. And humanity would never experience time the same way again. When the Ice Age was stable, cold, predictable, and consistently trying to kill you, belief systems tended to revolve around enduring the eternal freeze, respecting animal spirits, and appeasing whatever cosmic forces allowed humans to survive another day. But as the world warmed and everything began shifting, animals disappearing, landscapes drowning, rivers rerouting, weather flipping moods like an indecisive toddler, humans didn't just adapt physically and socially, they adapted spiritually. When the climate misbehaves, gods get busy. The natural world starts sending mixed messages. During the Ice Age, the environment was harsh but reliable. Snow did what snow was supposed to do. Herds followed paths older than memory. Winters behaved like winters. Terrible, icy, expected. But now, sudden storms appeared without warning. Plants sprouted in places they had no business sprouting. Rivers grew larger, then smaller, then larger again. The ocean wandered into former campsites like an uninvited guest. Animals migrated to new territories as if the world had misplaced the instruction manual. Humans needed explanations, not scientific ones, meaningful ones. Belief systems evolved to answer the most important questions of all. Why is everything changing? Who controls this? How do we make it stop? Ritual becomes a tool for understanding chaos. Rituals, already a part of human culture, expanded dramatically. If the world behaved unpredictably, rituals became anchors, ways to impose symbolic stability on chaotic reality. These rituals included marking seasonal transitions with chants or dances, giving thanks after successful hunts or harvests, burning offerings to spirits of water, land, or sky-carving symbols to speak, to unseen forces lighting communal fires to protect against environmental uncertainty. People didn't perform rituals because they were superstitious. They performed rituals because rituals gave shape to a world that suddenly had none. A ritual said, "We understand what's happening." A ritual implied, "We have influence over this." A ritual meant, "We're not powerless." And power, symbolic or imagined, helped people survive emotionally. Art becomes a response to instability. Long before villages or agriculture, humans created art everywhere. Carved bones, decorated stones, ochre-painted bodies, engraved river rocks, and images on cave walls. But during this transitional period, artistic expression appears to intensify and diversify. Why? Because art allowed humans to express fear when weather turned violent, celebrate the animals that still remained, remember landscapes that had changed or vanished, preserve stories of migrations and disasters represent spiritual beings who controlled the shifting world. Art became record-keeping without writing. Art became therapy. Art became communication, across generations, across groups, across landscapes that no longer existed. A disappearing mammoth could be kept alive through a picture. A drowned valley could survive in memory through carved patterns. A strange new plant could be recorded through pigment lines on stone. Art was not decoration. Art was survival, intellectual, emotional, spiritual. Spirits get busier, more numerous, and more opinionated. Before the great thaw, spirits might have been consistent. The spirit of the hunt, the spirit of cold, the spirit of fire, the spirit of a particular mountain. But as environmental upheaval intensified, spirits multiplied. If rivers changed direction, it must have been the river spirit moving home. If storms became unpredictable, sky spirits were obviously annoyed. If new plants appeared, these must belong to new earth spirits testing humanity. Spiritual beings became more dynamic because the world became more dynamic. Humans started thinking, each place might have a spirit. Each storm might have a personality. Each animal species might have its own guardian force. Each unexplained event might be a message. And they tried, in all sincerity, to interpret these messages correctly, because misinterpreting them felt dangerous. When the climate misbehaves, gods get busy. The rise of ritual specialists. As belief systems grew more complex, not everyone had the same interpretive skills. Some people, those with strong memories, vivid imaginations, or particularly persuasive storytelling abilities, became mediators between the human world and the invisible one. They were not yet priests, not yet shamans in the later sense. But they were dream interpreters, ritual organizers, singers who remembered ancestral stories, painters and carvers of symbolic images, keepers of migration myths, individuals trusted to read the signs of nature. Their authority was informal but deeply respected. When the world tilted unpredictably, these ritual specialists offered structure. They guided ceremonies, taught origin myths, and reassured people that the spirits could be appeased, even when environmental instability was clearly beyond human control. Myths changed to explain a moving world. Old myths about endless ice began to fade. New myths emerged, stories about the sea swallowing the land, stories about animals retreating to distant realms, stories of gods fighting, arguing, or reshaping the earth, stories explaining why certain plants grew where they once didn't, stories describing mountains waking up as glaciers melted from them. Myth became a tool to emotionally navigate the ungraspable. If the mammoths disappeared, myth said they had joined the spirit world. If the rivers flooded unpredictably, myth said the water god was restless. If berry patches failed, myth explained that the earth spirits were testing patience. Myths didn't fix problems, but they softened reality. Spiritual geography expands. As people migrated and returned seasonally to certain camps, they developed spiritual attachments to places. cliffs where ancestors were buried, rivers that never ran, dry hills where storms gathered dramatically, lakes filled with abundant fish forests where rare plants grew. These weren't yet sacred in the later religious sense, but they were meaningful. They became destinations for rituals, storytelling, and communal gatherings. Even if humans moved constantly, these places offered continuity in a shifting world. The emotional logic of belief systems, helped humans process unpredictability, fear, loss, change, hope. When you don't know why your valley flooded or why certain animals vanished, belief gives you a way to understand, even if the explanation lives in metaphor instead of measurement. Belief systems grew not because humans were irrational, but because humans were trying to stay rational in an irrational world. Spirituality as adaptation. Belief didn't just soothe fears, it guided behavior. Rituals promoted group unity. Spiritual taboos prevented overharvesting myth. Reinforced migration timing ceremonies strengthened social bonds. Storytelling preserved ecological knowledge. Spiritually guided rules often aligned with practical survival, whether intentionally or not. Humans weren't building temples yet. They were building meaning that travelled with them, meaning that explained a world that refused to sit still. When the climate misbehaves, gods get busy, and so did the people who believed in them. For most of the Ice Age, groups were small, land was vast, and avoiding other humans was the simplest conflict resolution strategy ever invented. If you didn't like your neighbours, you just walked away. There was always somewhere else to go. Personal space was infinite. Drama was optional. But as the world warmed and resources rearranged themselves unpredictably, that luxury evaporated. Camps grew, populations expanded, coastlines shrank, rivers shifted, valleys flooded, animals migrated in new patterns, plants popped up in one place and vanished from another. And suddenly, humans found themselves bumping into each other far more often than evolution had emotionally prepared them for. Sharing ends when food gets weird. Why scarcity makes people. Spiky scarcity wasn't constant, just unpredictable. One season was abundant, the next was pitiful. Fishing spots changed, gathering grounds fluctuated, animal migrations faltered. A swamp that fed your group last year might be underwater or barren the next. People could adapt to many things, but they never adapted peacefully to hunger. When food security became wobbly, even cooperative groups developed tense undercurrents. Whispers about who was taking more than their share. Side-eyeing neighbours who returned too quickly or too slowly from foraging. Suspicion toward visitors who arrived at precisely the wrong time, the hungry time. Anxiety about whether the next season would be generous or cruel. And anxiety, when shared across a whole group, tends to sharpen everyone's elbows. Territoriality, a new and uncomfortable idea. Territory wasn't much of a concept when the world was covered in steppe and ice. But forests, wetlands, and river valleys created concentrated pockets of resources, places worth defending. Groups began informally claiming areas they used seasonally. A salmon-rich river bend a hillside with predictable berry patches, a lake inlet with excellent spearfishing, a forest clearing full of nuts, a reliable freshwater spring. Claiming didn't mean building fences or drawing borders. It meant, we were here last year, we plan to be here next year, please don't mess this up for us. Territory was expressed through patterns of use, storytelling, ritual knowledge, and a shared understanding among neighbouring groups. But when resources got scarce, those boundaries, soft though they were, became points of friction. Meetings are awkward. When everyone is hungry. When two groups arrived at the same place at the same time, several outcomes were possible. Diplomacy, a mutually respectful conversation where sharing seemed feasible, at least temporarily. Negotiation. We fish in the morning, you fish in the evening. Avoidance. We will pretend you're not here if you pretend we're not here. Tension. Silence, glaring and clutching of spears. Violence. The unfortunate but inevitable outcome of scarcity meeting territoriality. Even peaceful groups carried weapons, not because they wanted war, but because showing up unarmed in an unpredictable world was basically volunteering to lose all your food. Evidence of violence appears in the archaeological record. Archaeologists examining this period find signs indicating real, tangible conflict. Skeletal trauma, skull fractures, embedded projectile points, cut marks, fortified positions, cliffside camps, intentionally placed barriers, burned structures, settlements destroyed abruptly. Mass graves, clustered burials suggesting group death events, rapid abandonment of sites, camps left suddenly, with tools still lying around. These traces don't mean constant war. They mean intermittent situational violence, flares of conflict during moments when cooperation failed, territories overlapped, or food shortages pushed groups past negotiation. Humans weren't bloodthirsty. They were desperate. The climate changed faster than social systems could adjust, and scarcity pushed people to extremes. Internal group tension. Conflict starts at home. Conflict didn't only occur between groups. Within camps, resources created friction. Who got priority access to dried fish? Who contributed enough to merit additional portions? Who was slacking? Who was secretly hoarding nuts behind their sleeping mat? Who tried to skip their turn maintaining the communal fire? Who took the good spear without asking? Small grievances amplified when everyone's stomach growled louder than the group storyteller. Some conflicts were resolved through negotiation, some through ritual, some through exile, some through violence. If someone consistently disrupted group harmony by stealing food, refusing to help, or provoking constant disputes, they could be forced out. Exile wasn't common, but it was a final, devastating punishment. It meant surviving without the safety net of numbers. Competition over new and unpredictable resources. The environmental chaos of the early Holocene created new forms of competition. Fishing spots were now prime real estate. Nut-rich forests attracted multiple groups. River crossings became choke points where groups frequently met. Plant patches that had once regrown reliably now fluctuated wildly, increasing tension over access. Animals were smaller and more mobile, making encounters with other hunters more frequent. Competition wasn't constant, but it was regular enough to shape social behavior, migration strategies, and even tool development. Shared prey leads to shared anger. Imagine tracking a deer for half a day, quiet, patient, careful, only for another group to appear from the bushes and act like they had been tracking it the whole time. You would not be thrilled. Such scenarios led to disputes that sometimes escalated into shouting, posturing, weapon-brandishing defensive stances, or occasionally a genuine fight competition over kills, likely prompted early forms of formal or informal treaties between neighbouring groups. Rules like, if we wound it, it's ours. If it crosses into your area, we split it. If both groups arrive at the same time, we share. These agreements weren't written, but they were crucial. The emotional toll, fear, mistrust, and exhaustion. Conflict was draining, physically and mentally. Groups constantly balanced cooperation and confrontation, generosity and suspicion, openness and caution. Every encounter with outsiders carried mixed feelings: curiosity, fear, opportunity, potential violence. People sang, painted, told myths, and performed rituals partly to cope with the psychological burden of living in a world where resources were unstable and strangers unpredictable. Conflict didn't define humanity, but it shaped it. Despite everything, humans did not devolve into constant warfare. Cooperation still dominated daily life. Trade persisted. Intergroup marriage occurred. Ritual gatherings happened. People still shared songs, stories, and knowledge. Violence was not the norm. Violence was the pressure valve of scarcity. When resources were plentiful, peace flourished. When resources tightened, tension rose. When tension spiked, conflict erupted. Sharing ends when food gets weird. But the ability to negotiate, compromise, and rebuild relationships helped humans endure even the harshest periods of scarcity. In the harshest days of the Ice Age, childhood was brutally short. Not biologically, children were still children, but socially. The world demanded early competence. Kids needed to walk, follow, listen, observe, and learn at a speed dictated by hunger and cold. A 5-year-old wasn't a toddler. A 5-year-old was an apprentice survivalist with a tiny stomach and big responsibilities. But as the climate warmed and human life grew more complex, more plants, more technologies, more variable environments, more social rules, more everything, childhood transformed into something new, a long-term investment. Kids aren't cute, they're backup plans. Why childhood gets longer. When life gets complicated. When humanity's toolkits expanded, diets diversified, and survival strategies multiplied, it suddenly took longer to learn how to be a functioning adult. Hunting required more precision. Gathering required more botanical knowledge. Fishing required understanding of water, seasons, and tides. Social norms became intricate. Conflict resolution became essential. Storytelling and myth became cultural glue. You couldn't teach a child all of that in a couple of years. Humans needed extended learning periods, longer than any other animal on Earth. Biology didn't change overnight. Culture did. The more knowledge society held, the more time children needed to absorb it. Children become knowledge projects. Every child represented future labour, future hunters or gatherers, future toolmakers, future negotiators, future memory keepers, future guides for seasonal timing, future defenders, future parents who would pass knowledge on children, became repositories for knowledge that elders carried, knowledge that could not be written, drawn, or preserved any other way. Teaching wasn't optional. It was a survival obligation. Adults tried to cram thousands of years of accumulated wisdom into small, curious, distractible brains that would occasionally wander off to poke frogs or stack rocks when they were supposed to be learning spear safety. Skill teaching, the world's first multi-year curriculum. The curriculum wasn't formal, but it was extensive. Kids learned how to spot edible plants without poisoning themselves, how to follow animal tracks in mud, dust, snow, or forest, how to use tools safely and efficiently, how to interpret signs of weather, how to behave during hunts, how to carry fire without burning their own faces, how to cooperate with other children, a miracle in itself, how to avoid snakes, swamps, cliffs, and angry adults. And this was just the practical side. There were also moral, social, and spiritual lessons. When sharing was mandatory, how to show respect to elders, when rituals required silence, what stories meant, which taboos to follow, how to interpret signs from nature or spirits. Children absorbed thousands of micro-rules simply by existing within the group. Teaching occurred everywhere, during walks, hunts, meals, quiet evenings, and dramatic mistakes that instantly became educational parables. Generational memory. Kids become the archive. Without writing, without permanent settlements, without lasting monuments, humanity's entire memory existed inside human minds. Children weren't just learning skills, they were being imprinted with migration paths, safe campsites, stories of environmental disasters, knowledge of drowned landscapes, locations of seasonal resources, rituals tied to specific places, genealogies and alliances, warnings about unfriendly neighbours. Children were the flash drives of prehistory, living storage units carrying everything forward. A child who paid attention became an elder who saved the group. A child who didn't pay attention Well, they either learned fast or nature taught them faster. Play becomes training. People tend to imagine prehistoric childhood as joyless, but children played constantly. However, their play had purpose. Almost every game taught something useful. Throwing stones, hunting accuracy, chasing each other, endurance training, climbing trees, spatial awareness, pretending to track animals, tracking practice, copying adults with miniature tools, skill rehearsal wrestling, physical training and conflict navigation. Play was not leisure. It was an evolutionary trick to disguise education as fun. Children who mastered play mastered survival. The work of raising kids is shared. Child-rearing wasn't a private family affair. It was communal because more adults meant more teachers, older kids supervised, younger kids, grandparents transmitted knowledge, adults didn't have time for multiple caregivers, reduced risk in dangerous environments. This cooperative childcare structure had enormous benefits. A child raised by many adults learned faster, developed more skills, created stronger social bonds, and absorbed more knowledge than a child raised in isolation. Yes, it also meant more people yelling their name when they wandered too close to a river. Adolescence. The trial period for adulthood. By adolescence, a young person wasn't just practicing, they were contributing. Teenagers joined hunts in lesser roles, gathered independently, made their own tools, helped with fire tending, fished in groups, remembered migration cues, participated in rituals, defended the camp when necessary. Adolescence was the bridge between learning and doing, and with increasing complexity in society and technology, adolescence grew more important. You weren't considered an adult because you looked older. You were considered an adult because you demonstrated competence. Why children became the most valuable resource. As environments destabilized, population numbers mattered more. Losing a child meant losing future labor, future adaptability, future memory, future parenthood, future problem-solving capability. This is why sickness was feared, injuries were treated urgently. Children were rarely placed in dangerous roles. Rituals protected them symbolically. Communities invested immense time teaching them. Children represented the group's continuity. Every one of them was a small insurance policy against a world that refused to stay predictable. Kids aren't cute. They're backup plans. Children were adorable, yes, but that was secondary. Their true value was strategic. They preserved knowledge. They expanded labor. They adapted faster to new tools and new environments. They ensured the group's survival into seasons people had not yet seen. The long, extended childhood of humans was not a mistake of evolution. It was our winning strategy. Other animals grew faster. Other animals matured quicker. But no species accumulated knowledge the way humans did, passed it down as meticulously, or used children as vessels for cultural endurance. Kids aren't cute, they're backup plans. And thanks to them, humanity didn't just survive the end of the Ice Age, it learned how to thrive in the unpredictable world that followed. When the Ice Age ended, no creature on Earth looked particularly prepared. Plants were scrambling into new climates. Animals were migrating as if their compasses had melted. Rivers wandered drunkenly across the land. Seas crept inland like slow, salty thieves. Everything was improvising. And then there were humans, improvising the hardest of all, not the strongest, just the most stubborn. Adaptation through sheer determination. If a creature watched humanity from a distance, it might have concluded the following. These small, hairless bipeds should not survive. Humans lacked claws, lacked fur insulation, lacked natural armor, lacked venom, and lacked the ability to hibernate during miserable seasons. What they did have was an unshakable tendency to adapt to anything. When the weather changed, they changed their behavior. When the land shifted, they shifted their strategies. When food sources disappeared, they invented new ways to find or create food. This wasn't elegance, it wasn't efficiency. It was pure, relentless flexibility. Humans became experts at adjusting without complaining aloud. Complaining silently, however, was constant. Innovation, humanity's favourite coping mechanism. The end of the Ice Age was a masterclass in whole world under renovation. Please mind the chaos. Instead of resisting, humans weaponized creativity. If one method failed, they invented another. New weapons for smaller, faster prey. New fishing tools for deeper or shifting waters. New food processing techniques for challenging plants. New construction methods for unstable climates. New symbolic systems to interpret a changing world. Innovation became the default response to disaster. If a river turned into a marsh, humans didn't panic. They built traps for marsh animals. If a forest replaced grassland, they didn't despair. They adapted their foraging methods. If a favourite migration route became flooded, they found or forged a new one. Where other animals specialised, humans diversified. Where other species followed instinct, humans followed imagination. Mental adaptation, thinking beats, freezing. Environmental chaos didn't just require physical adjustment, it demanded psychological evolution. Humans learned to live with uncertainty, seasonal instability, unpredictable food cycles, shifting geographies, and the emotional rollercoaster of, why is the climate doing that now? They developed long-term planning, mapping memories, seasonal prediction, and the ability to connect cause and effect in ways that allowed whole groups to make coordinated decisions. It wasn't enough to survive today. You had to predict tomorrow's problems before they arrived, wearing muddy boots and demanding attention. Human stubbornness wasn't just physical endurance, it was mental elasticity. Cooperation as a superpower. Other species cooperated, but humans took coordination to an advanced level. Group survival demanded communication, role distribution, conflict navigation, and synchronized labor. Cooperation became refined in ways no other species matched. People specialized in different tasks, creating shared expertise. Teams conducted hunts requiring complex silent coordination. Multi-family groups processed large amounts of food efficiently. Shared rituals reinforced unity in the face of uncertainty. Trading knowledge and materials with neighbours became essential for resilience. Humanity's ability to work in groups gave them an advantage that no claw, fang, or muscle mass could provide. You didn't need to be the strongest animal if you could gather 40 cooperative friends with spears, baskets, nets, or fire. Stubbornness as evolutionary strategy survival wasn't elegant, it was stubborn. Humans persisted in environments that logically should have overwhelmed them. Unpredictable flooding, sudden temperature swings, landscapes transforming within a generation. Animal populations collapsing, rising seas, erasing familiar territory. The correct instinct might have been to panic. The human instinct was to try again until something worked. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't dominance, it was refusal to quit. When seasons betrayed them, they adapted. When megafauna vanished, they diversified. When rivers rewrote their paths, humans rewrote their strategies. When food ran scarce, they invented storage, trapping, fishing, and proto-cultivation. Humans weren't unbeatable, just impossible to permanently beat. Cultural innovation, surviving with meaning. Survival wasn't just physical. Humans adapted culturally. They created rituals to manage fear. They told stories to transmit vital knowledge. They developed symbols, art, and shared memories to unite groups. They formed identity around land, seasons, ancestors, and experience. These cultural tools allowed communities to remain cohesive during upheaval. They transformed chaos into meaning, so people didn't simply survive. They endured with purpose. A group that believes its actions matter can withstand far more than a group that believes the world is random. Belief became adaptation. Culture wasn't decoration, culture was survival tech. Humans spread everywhere, not because they wanted to, but because they could. The end of the Ice Age forced movement, but humans took that movement to its logical extreme. They didn't stay confined to one biome. They pushed into every possible niche: dense forests, open plains, river valleys, coastal wetlands, highlands, deserts, islands emerging from glacial retreat. Every time a new environment posed a challenge, humans answered with experimentation. They didn't always succeed on the first try, or the second, or the third. But trying repeatedly was humanity's default setting. Stubbornness plus creativity equals dominance. Humans weren't the fastest, or the strongest, or the largest, or the best armed. They were the ones who refused to accept defeat as a conclusion. And this mindset created a feedback loop. Flexibility led to innovation. Innovation led to survival. Survival led to population growth. Population growth led to cultural complexity. Cultural complexity led to even more flexibility. By the time the post-Ice Age world stabilized, humans had become the most adaptable species on the planet, not through brute force, but through a mixture of cooperation, creativity, memory, endurance, and yes, old-fashioned stubbornness. Not the strongest, just the most stubborn. And stubbornness, at the end of the Ice Age, turned out to be evolution's winning lottery ticket. Here's the good news. Humans survived the end of the Ice Age. Here's the bad news. They did it by never relaxing again. By the time the Ice Age melted into history, humanity had achieved something miraculous. Not through comfort, not through stability, but through constant improvisation. The world kept changing, and humans kept changing faster. Rest became a theoretical concept. Peace was a seasonal visitor. The only constant was effort, and yet they made it. The good news: humans endured what should have broken them. Let's take a moment to appreciate what people actually overcame. Entire landscapes sinking beneath rising seas. Animals they relied on disappearing forever. Seasons behaving like they were making up rules on the spot. Populations rising and crowding spaces that once felt limitless. Social systems becoming more complex than anyone intended, tools, diets, and habitats evolving faster than any generation could fully process. Any one of these changes would have overwhelmed a less adaptable species. Together, they created a world that was, by all rights, too unpredictable to survive. But humans did. They invented new tools, new strategies, new stories, new rules, new ways of being. They kept moving, shifting, adjusting again, and stubbornly refusing to let the planet's chaos dictate their extinction. They didn't survive because the world was kind. They survived because they were relentless. The bad news: survival required constant vigilance. The end of the Ice Age didn't deliver stability. It delivered homework. Every day brought something new to interpret. Where did the animals move this year? Why did the river change direction again? When will the moon signal the next fish run? Which plants sprouted early and which never returned? Was that a normal storm or a sign the sky spirits were annoyed? Did your neighbours come to trade or to claim the good berry patch? Why does your favourite campsite now belong to a lake? Humans didn't get to settle. They didn't get to pause. They didn't get to confidently say, "We've figured life out." Every adaptation they made created 3 new challenges they had to solve immediately. Relaxation became a luxury. Predictability became an illusion. Survival became a full-time mental job. No weekends, no holidays. Resilience, humanity's real superpower. Anatomy didn't save humans. Strength didn't save humans. Even tools, on their own, didn't save humans. What saved them was resilience, an instinctive ability to keep going no matter how bizarre or inconvenient the world became. Resilience meant learning from failure instead of surrendering to it, rebuilding camps after floods washed them away, adjusting migrations when animals changed their routes, teaching children everything before mistakes killed them, negotiating peace when conflict drained resources, performing rituals to soothe fear and restore unity, inventing technologies to solve problems no one had ever encountered before. Resilience didn't look heroic. It looked like waking up every day knowing the world had changed again and adapting anyway. Realism, seeing the world clearly, surviving it. Anyway. By the time the Ice Age ended, humans were under no illusions. Nature wasn't stable. Food wasn't guaranteed. Landscapes weren't permanent. Cooperation wasn't optional. Life wasn't fair. Survival wasn't pretty. This realism became a psychological adaptation. People learned to live with uncertainty, not deny it. They learned to expect change, not fear it. They learned that the universe offered no promises, so they made their own resilience the only reliable promise they could depend on. Realism didn't make life easier. It made life possible. Improvisation. The blueprint for modern humanity. Modern humans inherit all of this. The instincts, the flexibility, the stubborn creativity that allowed their ancestors to survive a world that kept reinventing itself every generation. Everything we call human today, culture, planning, technology, cooperation, adaptability, was forged in this era of relentless change. The end of the Ice Age didn't just reshape the planet, it reshaped the species that walked across it. Our world today, cities, languages, innovation, organization, exists because prehistoric humans learned to survive by switching strategies, constantly innovating at every crisis, sharing knowledge, widely distributing roles across the group, preparing for futures they could barely predict, refusing to collapse when everything else collapsed around them. Modern life looks calm and stable compared to the chaos of the early Holocene. But underneath that calm lives the same improvisational engine. Plan, revise, adapt, repeat. The final reflection. Humanity's greatest story isn't comfort, it's continuity. The end of the Ice Age didn't give humans paradise. It gave them challenge after challenge, forcing them to evolve culturally, technologically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And they did it. Not with ease, not with certainty, not with comfort, but with the strange, unstoppable determination that defines our species. The good news, humans survived one of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's history. The bad news, they survived by never relaxing again, and modern life is built on that legacy. We don't descend from the strongest creatures. We descend from the creatures who adapted, improvised, and kept going long after logic said they shouldn't. Not the strongest, not the fastest, just the most stubborn. And that stubbornness carried humanity through the end of the Ice Age and into everything that followed.